Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The average day for a caveman began at dawn or slightly before, depending on how loud the wind was or whether someone nearby started coughing again. Most people slept on animal hides or directly on packed earth, sometimes with a layer of dried grass or leaves for padding. You probably slept near a fire, not for ambience, for heat, and to keep insects and predators away. Sleeping away from the group wasn't really an option unless you wanted to wake up missing a foot. Most people slept in small, tight groups, families, extended families, and whoever else was part of the local band. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone heard everything. The first thing you did after waking up was check the fire. If it went out, someone had to restart it. That could take time, patience, and a lot of rubbing sticks together. If it was cold out, which depending on the season it often was, everyone would be cranky until it came back to life. Next, you might look over your tools and weapons, spears, knives, scrapers, anything that could be used for hunting or protection. These had to be kept in good condition. Losing your tools meant losing your ability to get food, defend yourself, or process meat and hides. Some people in the group were better at this than others, and it wasn't unusual to borrow gear from someone more skilled, though they probably expected something in return. Children were usually the first to make noise. They'd start moving around, looking for something to eat or something to do, often both. Adults would slowly get up and begin preparing for the day. That could mean gathering water, checking nearby traps, or heading out to look for signs of animal movement. No one eased into the day. There was no time for that. Your daily goal was simple. Stay warm, find food, and avoid injury. If you woke up in one piece, your fire was still burning, and nothing outside looked immediately dangerous. You were already ahead. In the Paleolithic era, personal hygiene existed, just not in the way we think of it today. Cleanliness was mostly practical, not aesthetic. You cleaned yourself when it started interfering with your ability to live, or when the smell became a group issue. Bathing happened, but it depended heavily on the season and environment. If there was a stream, people washed in it when the water wasn't freezing. Otherwise, cleaning might involve wiping off dirt with leaves, handfuls of sand, or on rare luxury occasions, animal fat. That's right, fat could be used to scrub the skin, which sounds odd until you realize it also helped with warmth and insect control. Teeth were another story. There were no toothbrushes, but some people chewed fibrous sticks or bones to clean their teeth. Dental wear was common, especially since the Paleolithic diet involved tough meat, unprocessed grains, and sand particles from grinding stones that got into food. Cavemen didn't brush, but they also didn't eat candy, so cavities were rare. Tooth loss from injury or wear, however, was a different matter. Hair care was minimal. Hair was usually long, tied back, or simply ignored. Lice were common. Some groups used ash, dirt, or animal oils to reduce infestations. Others may have resorted to the always effective method of scratching a lot and hoping it goes away. There's also evidence from later prehistoric periods of primitive combs or grooming tools, so some effort was made eventually. Clothing didn't help matters. Animal hides weren't breathable, and they weren't washed often. If they smelled, people either got used to it or blamed the person sitting closest to the fire. Feet were mostly bare or covered in wraparound hide shoes. As you can imagine, the smell of a prehistoric cave was distinctive. But here's the surprising part. Despite the lack of soap or showers, early humans adapted well. Their immune systems were strong, and their communities understood enough about cleanliness to avoid major outbreaks. In fact, people probably smelled about the same, so no one really noticed unless you did something extreme like roll in a dead animal. Which, by the way, some people did for camouflage breakfast. There was no set time to eat. People ate when they could, what they could, and only if there was anything left over from the day before. If you woke up to find a bit of dried meat still hanging by the fire, congratulations, you'd won the prehistoric lottery. But most mornings didn't start that way. If last night's hunt had failed, or the food was already eaten, or stolen by a raccoon-like creature with ambition, then breakfast meant foraging. This might involve digging for roots, checking nearby berry bushes, or scanning the landscape for edible plants that hadn't already been claimed by animals or children. The choices were seasonal. Spring meant greens, summer brought fruits, and winter brought hunger. Protein was more unpredictable. Small animals like birds, rabbits, or insects were occasionally caught and eaten whole or roasted. Insects were a reliable protein source, even if nobody was particularly excited about it. If you found a termite mound or a handful of grubs, that might become the morning meal. They didn't taste great, but they didn't bite back either. Sometimes you'd share with others, especially within your own family group, but food was a resource, not a courtesy. If someone brought back breakfast, it meant they were either generous or in charge, or both. Water was another priority. Streams, springs, and rivers were the main sources, if you were lucky. If not, puddles had to do. Boiling water wasn't a common practice yet, so most water was consumed raw and occasionally accompanied by bacteria your gut either defeated or deeply regretted. Occasionally there'd be a leftover from the last big hunt. Smoked meat, marrow from cracked bones, or dried strips of hide that were technically edible with enough chewing. These were valuable. People stored them high, wrapped, or hidden, though nothing could stop a determined child with a stick. So every morning was a new gamble. Maybe you'd find a few berries and a half-roasted squirrel. Maybe you'd find nothing. Either way, no one skipped breakfast on purpose. After breakfast, or the realization that breakfast wasn't happening, the next big task of the day was tool maintenance. Tools weren't just accessories, they were survival equipment without a good edge. You couldn't cut meat, scrape hides, or defend yourself. So a surprising amount of the day was spent hunched over rocks, hitting other rocks, trying to get just the right shape. Welcome to Paleolithic tool making. Part craftsmanship, part trial and error, and entirely dependent on not smashing your thumb. The raw material of choice? Flint or obsidian. If you were feeling fancy and lived near a volcano, these stones chipped predictably, which meant you could flake off sharp edges and create cutting tools. The basic starter pack included hand axes, scrapers, spearheads, and the very popular rock with a handle. There's no one-size-fits-all. Each tool had a purpose, some for butchering, others for shaping wood, and some for tasks we still don't fully understand but probably involved hitting things. Most people made their own tools, but like everything else, some were better at it than others. If someone in the group had a knack for making perfectly balanced spear points, they earned respect and requests. Sharpening tools were constant. A dull edge was basically useless and worse, dangerous. You'd either hurt yourself or waste time. Stones were ground, flaked, and tested daily. And yes, sometimes this meant spending 2 hours making something that broke after 2 minutes of use. You didn't complain. You just started over. Toolkits were often passed down, traded, or even stolen. If you lost yours, you weren't just embarrassed. You were in serious trouble. The moment you had nothing sharp on hand was usually the moment something with claws showed up. Occasionally, creativity kicked in. Someone might tie a rock to a stick with animal sinew and call it a hammer. Others discovered bone tools that were flexible. Lightweight and perfect for fine tasks, these innovations were the seeds of later technological revolutions, even if their inventors were mostly just trying to cut something faster. Once the tools were ready and breakfast, or the lack thereof, had been resolved, it was time to tackle the main event, the hunt. Hunting in the Paleolithic world wasn't a solo hobby. It was a full team operation, often involving every able-bodied member of the group, plus one guy who mostly shouted useful things like "go left," and that's not a deer. Large animals were the jackpot. Mammoths, bison, wild horses. Anything big enough to feed the entire group for a week was worth the risk. But they were also dangerous. Mammoths didn't just stand around waiting to be speared. They were fast, heavy, and had no patience for hairless bipeds with wooden sticks. Planning a hunt took real coordination. Scouts went ahead to track herds. Others prepared traps, pits covered with branches, natural choke points near rivers, or just steep cliffs if the group was feeling ambitious and slightly reckless. Then came the ambush, yelling, spear throwing, and a lot of running. The hope was that something large would go down, preferably before someone in your group did for smaller game, deer, boars, or even rabbits. The process was more straightforward. Spears, clubs, and clever ambushes were used. Traps and snares helped too, especially for solo or small group hunters. But even with smaller animals, things went wrong. One misstep, and suddenly you were chasing a pig through the woods while trying to explain to your group how you almost had it. Sometimes the hunting party came back victorious, dragging meat, bones, and bragging rights. Other times they came back with nothing but scrapes and excuses. The wind shift was a popular one. So was blaming whoever sneezed during the ambush. Meat wasn't just food, it was status. The person who delivered the kill often earned first pick, more respect, and fewer chores that night. But sharing was still common. You needed your group, and burning bridges over meat led to awkward silences around the fire. Hunting wasn't just about survival. It was teamwork, risk, and real-time strategy, all while trying not to get trampled. Not everyone in the Paleolithic world chased mammoths. Some people had a much more practical job finding things that didn't fight back. Foraging wasn't as dramatic as hunting, but it was essential and frankly more successful most of the time. You didn't always catch a deer, but odds were decent. You'd find a berry bush, the foraging crew, often made up of women, older adults, and kids who weren't old enough to throw a spear without hitting a tree, covered a lot of ground. They searched for edible plants, berries, nuts, roots, seeds, mushrooms, and anything else that didn't taste like regret. Knowing what was safe to eat was a matter of experience, trial and error, and unfortunately, the occasional funeral. Foragers developed strong mental maps of their terrain. They remembered which valleys had tubers, which trees dropped the best nuts, and which plants looked edible but definitely weren't. They passed this knowledge down carefully. Mistaking a good route for a poisonous one could turn your afternoon snack into an emergency. But it wasn't all safe and slow-paced. Sometimes foragers had to deal with wildlife too. Competing with birds, squirrels, or even bears over berries was a very real thing. And stepping into a wasp nest while reaching for honey was a mistake no one made twice voluntarily. Foraging also meant multitasking. While gathering food, people might also collect firewood, feathers, bark, or herbs for medicine. Children tagged along, learning the ropes, and occasionally trying to eat things they shouldn't. You kept an eye on them and try not to lose track of anyone while arguing over whether that mushroom looked weird this time. The food gathered was often more reliable than hunted meat. Plants don't run away. Nuts don't stab you. And if you timed it right, a single day's harvest could feed the group for several meals, or at least provide snacks between failed hunts. Foragers were the quiet heroes of the tribe. They weren't dramatic. They didn't show off. But when the hunting party returned empty-handed, it was the gatherers who saved dinner. If there was one thing that made Paleolithic life even remotely manageable, it was fire. Fire cooked your food, kept you warm, scared off predators, and let you see your own feed after sunset. Without it, your odds of survival dropped fast, which is why every group had an unspoken rule. Don't let the fire go out. Someone, usually whoever got the short end of the stick that day, was put on fire duty. This meant keeping an eye on the flames, feeding it with wood, and occasionally panicking if the wind shifted or the coals looked too dim. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. You could go without breakfast. You could limp through a bad hunt. But if the fire went out, now that was a group emergency. Starting a fire from scratch wasn't easy. It involved friction-based tools like fire drills or hand-spinning sticks over dry wood. If your hands were cold or your material damp, you could be there all day, hoping a tiny ember showed mercy. This is why many groups try to keep a single fire going at all times, even when moving camp. In some cases, someone literally carried a glowing coal wrapped in moss or bark to keep the flame alive on the road. This person had one job and the pressure was very real. Fuel collection was part of the deal, too. Dry wood, kindling, animal dung, whatever burned without exploding was fair game. Children often helped, though they sometimes brought back things that looked flammable but absolutely weren't, like wet logs or half-buried mushrooms. Fire maintenance also had a social side. The fire was the center of camp life. People sat around it, told stories, shared food, and argued about whose turn it was to keep watch. The fire pit was, in a way, the original living room. Except if someone fell asleep on duty, it could freeze everyone to death. No one got praise for keeping the fire going, but if it went out, there were no excuses. Just a lot of angry looks and the sentence. Guess who's making sparks tonight? Contrary to popular belief, not every prehistoric person lived in a cave. Caves were great if you could find one. Natural shelter, wind protection, and built-in walls. But they weren't always available, especially if other groups or wild animals had already claimed them. So, like any determined human, early people built their own homes. Sort of. Construction in the Paleolithic era wasn't about aesthetics. There were no blueprints, no architects, and certainly no HOA regulations. The main goal was simple: keep the weather out and the people in. If you live in an area without usable caves, you probably built huts or shelters from wood, bones, mud, grass, and whatever else was lying around. A solid framework of branches or mammoth ribs would be lashed together with animal sinew or vines, then covered with hides, bark, or packed dirt. The result? A lopsided structure that leaked slightly less than standing outside. Building was a group effort. One person held the sticks, another did the tying, and someone stood nearby pretending they knew what they were doing. If it collapsed halfway through, nobody was surprised. You just picked it up and tried again, this time with an extra stick. Weather was always a problem. Rain turned dirt floors into mud pits. Wind could rip hide coverings away like nature was trying to redecorate. Snow crushed entire shelters if they weren't reinforced. That's why some groups built seasonal structures, light summer huts that could be quickly abandoned, and heavier winter shelters for long, miserable stretches of frozen time. Insulation was a luxury. If you were lucky, animal hides covered the walls and floor. If not, you just layered up and complained. The fire stayed in the center, ideally with a hole in the roof to let smoke out, though it usually let in just as much cold furniture. Not really. A rock to sit on, a flat place to nap, and maybe a pile of hides for sleeping. Luxury was a warm corner with no drafts and a roof that didn't drip. And yet, even with limited materials, prehistoric people managed to build homes that worked. They weren't pretty, but they kept you alive, dryish, and occasionally upright during a windstorm. Parenting in the Paleolithic era came with no manuals, no podcasts, and definitely no baby strollers. Once a child was born, you were immediately responsible for keeping a small, loud, very breakable human alive in a world full of cliffs, predators, and sharp rocks. And you had to do it without losing your spear or your sanity. Childbirth itself was a community event, painful, messy, and risky. If you survived it, congratulations. Now came the next challenge, keeping your child warm, fed, and from sticking their fingers into the fire out of curiosity, which they did frequently. There were no diapers. Babies were swaddled in hides or plant fiber, and messes were just part of the job. You learned quickly to always set them down on rocks. Easier cleanup. Mothers usually breastfed for years since there was no baby formula. And chewing meat for a toddler was not considered efficient. Discipline was practical. If a kid wandered too close to a cliff, you didn't give them a timeout. You grabbed them by the leg and barked something like no fall. The stakes were high, and safety rules had to be taught fast. Touching fire, chasing wolves, or trying to eat unknown berries were considered teachable moments, ideally before anything exploded, burned, or caused hallucinations. But Paleolithic parenting wasn't all danger. Kids played constantly with sticks, stones, feathers, bugs, anything that looked remotely interesting. Play was how they learned. A child who liked throwing rocks might one day be the tribe's best hunter. A kid who sat still and watched the elders might become a shaman or healer. No one said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" You just became something. Depending on your survival skills and general luck, older children helped with chores, gathering, kindling, fetching water, chasing birds from drying meat. By the time they were 10, they were considered semi-functional members of society. Still annoying, but now useful. There was no formal education, but children learned through observation, repetition, and trial by mud. They didn't have toys, they had nature. And nature didn't come with safety labels. After a long day of hunting, gathering, scraping, dodging wild animals, and parenting without sedation, early humans finally got to enjoy a bit of what we might call downtime. Of course, Paleolithic social life wasn't exactly wine tastings and brunch, but it was something. The heart of social activity was the fire. Once the sun dipped low and visibility dropped to hope you don't trip over a sleeping dog, the group would circle around the flames, not for a party, but because it was the only source of warmth and light that didn't bite. Still, it served as the tribe's gathering point. Everyone came here to eat, talk, and unwind. Evening conversations weren't small talk about the weather. They were storytelling sessions. People shared the day's events, exaggerated hunts, and told tales about spirits, ancestors, or that one time someone fell into the river chasing a fish. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was how knowledge was passed down. What to eat, what to avoid, where the good hunting spots were, all wrapped in stories, complete with dramatic grunts and arm waving. Music and dancing also made appearances, though it wasn't exactly coordinated. Someone would bang to two stones together rhythmically, someone else might hum or chant, and suddenly three children would start spinning in circles because no one told them not to. Instruments included hollow bones, stretched high drums, and literally anything that made a vaguely satisfying sound. Bragging was also a big part of social life. If someone had a successful hunt, they would mention it repeatedly. If they made a sharp tool, they'd casually show it off while pretending not to care. Social status wasn't about wealth. It was about skills. Who could hunt? Who could lead? Who could keep the fire going without burning their own eyebrows off? And flirting. Oh, it happened. There weren't many options, so romantic gestures were often subtle. Sharing food, sitting closer to someone, or not laughing when they misidentified a pile of dung as a rare root. Relationships formed slowly, and usually with a quiet understanding that you didn't throw a rock at me today was a good sign. Courtship was subtle, practical, and usually involved more grunting than poetry. Still, early humans managed to figure out how to form partnerships. Somehow, despite the complete lack of scented candles or deodorant, the first step in courtship was proximity. You lived in a small band of maybe 20 to 40 people, which meant your dating pool was basically whoever hadn't already been claimed by someone else or wasn't related to you. Not ideal, but there was no prehistoric version of Tinder unless you count locking eyes while chewing the same piece of roasted squirrel. Flirting was quiet, and by today's standards, kind of strange. Sharing food was a big deal. If someone gave you the choicest piece of meat or a handful of berries they didn't technically have to part with, that was interesting. Helping someone scrape a hide or carry water. Also a green flag. Early romance was based on effort, not eloquence. Appearance mattered, but only up to a point. You weren't judged on your outfit. Everyone wore some variation of fur and dirt. What counted was your ability to survive. A good hunter or skilled forager had a better shot at attracting a mate than someone who sat by the fire all day carving questionable-looking statues. Pair bonds were often long-term, but not always permanent. People stayed together for cooperation, raising children, sharing food, surviving bad winters. If it wasn't working, a quiet separation occurred. No paperwork, just fewer shared tasks and more awkward silences during group meals. Sexual relationships were probably more flexible than modern assumptions allow. Some anthropologists suggest that early humans were less possessive than later agricultural societies. Group dynamics, survival needs, and mobility often shaped relationship norms more than personal jealousy. And of course, there were no love songs, just quiet companionship, a shared blanket, and a mutual understanding that neither of you wanted to get eaten alone. It may not have looked romantic, but it worked. Paleolithic couples built families, raised children, and made it through storms, all without once arguing about who forgot to do the dishes, mostly because there were no dishes. Despite the constant need to hunt, gather, and not die, early humans still found time for something uniquely human art. And while they didn't have galleries, museums, or the phrase that's very abstract, they did have walls. Big, cold cave walls. And apparently those were just begging for decoration. The earliest known cave paintings date back over 30,000 years. with famous examples found in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in modern-day France. These weren't random doodles. They featured animals like bison, deer, horses, and mammoths, often drawn with surprising accuracy and motion. Some had lines showing movement. Others had dots, handprints, or symbols whose meaning we still haven't cracked. What tools did they use? Nothing fancy, just natural pigments like charcoal, ochre, and manganese, crushed minerals mixed with water, fat, or spit. For brushes, they used fingers, sticks, chewed up ends of plants, or hollow bones to spray pigment across their stencil hands. Yes, prehistoric people invented airbrushing long before it showed up on motorcycles. Why did they paint? No one knows for sure. Maybe it was storytelling. Maybe spiritual beliefs. Maybe someone just had an eye for composition and no one told them to stop. Some anthropologists believe the art was connected to hunting rituals, a way to summon success or pass on knowledge about which animals to chase and which ones to avoid. The artists probably worked by firelight, deep inside caves in places no one lived, meaning they were making art just to make it. No commercial gain. No Instagram followers, just human expression in the rawest form. Kids likely got in on it, too. Some caves include tiny handprints, suggesting that even little ones were taught how to make their mark literally. And while we'll never know who made the first bison sketch, odds are someone stood behind him, grunting in approval or offering very unhelpful critiques. What's remarkable is that this art lasted. Long after the huts rotted and the fire pits crumbled, those painted animals still galloped across cave walls. Proof that even 30,000 years ago, humans needed more than just food and shelter they needed to create. Also, maybe they just really liked bison. Getting sick or injured in the Paleolithic era was a bit like rolling dice with the universe. Only the dice were made of bone and had mostly bad sides. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and definitely no urgent care. If you broke something, cut yourself, or developed a mysterious rash, the best case scenario was that your body handled it. The worst case scenario? Well, everyone gathered awkwardly around your fire and hoped it didn't look contagious. Medical care existed, but it was basic. Extremely basic. Early humans likely had some understanding of plants that reduced pain or inflammation. Chewed bark, roots, or crushed herbs might have served as primitive medicine. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. So somewhere out there, a Paleolithic person was the first to discover pain relief by gnawing on a tree. For wounds, treatment often involved cleaning the area with water or antiseptic plants, if known, wrapping it in animal hide or moss, and then watching it closely. Infection was the real killer, not the injury itself. There were no sterile bandages. If the wound got red, hot, and started to smell, well, that was the smell of bad news. Broken bones. Sometimes they healed, sometimes they didn't. There's archaeological evidence of prehistoric skeletons with healed fractures, suggesting that care was given and rest was enforced. But there were also people who clearly kept moving on bad limbs because there wasn't much choice. Toothaches were another issue. Teeth wore down from constant chewing of tough meat and grit-filled plants. Cavities weren't common, but tooth decay and jaw infections did happen. The solution? Removal with a rock and no anesthesia. Shamans or medicine people may have served as early doctors, part herbalist, part spiritual guide, part person who was willing to touch puss. They used rituals, chants, and substances we might now consider mildly hallucinogenic. Was it science? No. Did it work? Sometimes. The truth is, medical care back then was a combination of trial, error, and survival instincts. You got rest, you got attention, and sometimes you got lucky. And if you didn't, your spot by the fire went as someone else by nightfall in the Paleolithic world. There were no wagons, no wheels, no roads, and absolutely no concept of catching a ride. If you wanted to go somewhere, you walked. That was it. Travel wasn't a convenience. It was a physical commitment. Whether you were moving camp, following a game, or avoiding the neighbors who kept stealing your firewood, it always meant using your own 2 feet. Mobility was essential. Paleolithic groups were typically nomadic, moving as needed based on seasons, food availability, and possibly just to escape the smell of the old camp. Campsites didn't come with leases. Once the local resources were used up or if the mammoths moved on, the people followed. Trips could be short, a day's walk to a nearby hunting ground, or much longer, spanning dozens of miles over several days or even weeks. Everything had to be carried. Tools, hides, fire starting gear, food, if there was any left. And children all had to be packed up and hauled on your back. There were no suitcases, just bags made from leather or baskets made from woven reeds. And don't forget the weather. Traveling meant exposure. Rain, wind, snow. You endured it all, possibly while trying to convince a tired 5-year-old that yes, they really did have to keep walking again uphill. Navigation wasn't done with maps. People used memory, landmarks, star patterns, animal tracks, and oral knowledge passed through generations. That mountain that looks like a sleeping bear, or the bend in the river that smells funny were as close to street signs as you got. Group movement had to be organized. Scouts might go ahead to check for threats. Everyone else moved carefully, often in single file. If someone got injured, the entire group slowed down. If the weather turned, you found shelter. Fast. Speed was important, but so was staying together. Getting separated in prehistoric wilderness was rarely survivable. Despite all that, people covered serious ground. Fossils and artifacts show that Paleolithic humans migrated across continents on foot. No GPS, no water bottles, no Spotify, just survival, sore feet, and the unshakable human drive to see what was beyond the next hill. After a long day of hunting, gathering, walking, parenting, tool fixing, and generally not dying, early humans ended their day in the only place that made sense around a fire. The sun dropped quickly, and with no electric lights or lanterns, darkness arrived fast and without negotiation. That's when the group settled in for the night's final act, equal parts winding down and survival maintenance. Dinner, if you were lucky, involved roasted meat, boiled roots, or whatever edible thing didn't escape earlier. Meals were shared communally, everyone sitting in a loose circle, crouched or cross-legged, eating with hands, bones, or the occasional sharpened stick. There was no formal etiquette, but unspoken rules definitely applied. For example, don't snatch the last bite unless you were the one who speared it. After eating, people talked, not just survival plans or food logistics. They shared stories, myths, memories, cautionary tales about that one guy who tried to hug a porcupine. Oral storytelling was the Paleolithic version of Netflix minus buffering. These stories passed down knowledge, entertained kids, and probably exaggerated everyone's hunting skills by at least 30%. Sometimes there was singing, rhythmic, simple chants, or calls passed between voices. A piece of bone might double as a flute, a hollow log, drum. The music wasn't polished, but it didn't have to be. It kept the cold away just a little longer. By now, most people were physically drained. The day didn't leave much energy for deep philosophical discussions. Kids passed out first, curled up next to parents or in a pile of furs. Adults lingered longer, staring into the fire like it held answers. Or maybe just zoning out. Same thing. Before sleep, someone always checked the fire, the unsung hero of the group. If the flames looked low, they were fed. If the wind shifted, barriers were adjusted. And if someone forgot to check, well, they'd hear about it first thing in the morning. In December 1938, two German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, bombarded uranium with neutrons, and the results were baffling. They hadn't just altered the element, they had split it. Nuclear fission had just been discovered. Word of the experiment raced through the global physics community like a lightning strike. And while the implications were still theoretical, one thing was instantly clear. If fission could be controlled and harnessed, it could unleash an explosion of unimaginable power. And that terrified the scientific world, especially in the United States. Because Nazi Germany, home to some of the brightest physicists on Earth, had just taken the first step toward a doomsday weapon. Physicist Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jew who had fled Europe, immediately grasped the stakes. If Hitler's scientists built an atomic bomb first, the world wouldn't just lose a war. It might lose its future. Alongside fellow refugee Albert Einstein, Szilard drafted a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that the Germans might be working on exactly that. Einstein signed it. The letter was delivered in October 1939. Less than 2 months after World War II had begun, Roosevelt didn't rush into action, but he didn't ignore it either. He formed an advisory committee on uranium. Funding trickled in slowly. At first, the United States simply wasn't ready to take nuclear physics seriously as a weapon of war. That would soon change. By 1941, the British had confirmed the bomb's feasibility. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, the US had entered the war, and what started as a vague concern suddenly became a high-stakes, time-sensitive race. Enter General Leslie Groves, a no-nonsense military man who just built the Pentagon. He was appointed head of the newly minted Manhattan Engineer District in 1942. Its purpose? Simple on paper. Build an atomic bomb before the Nazis did. In practice, it was the most secretive, expensive, and scientifically complex project ever attempted. Groves brought in a young, flamboyant theoretical physicist to lead the science. J. Robert Oppenheimer. Brilliant, controversial, idealistic. A man who could calculate particle probabilities and quote Sanskrit poetry in the same breath. Together, they launched what would become known as the Manhattan Project, a $2 billion gamble that would forever change the nature of warfare and the fate of the world. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a lab experiment. It was an empire. To pull off the impossible, the U.S. government created an entire hidden civilization stretching across the country, shrouded in secrecy. No one outside the project knew its real purpose. Most of the people inside didn't either. At the heart of this secret world were three main sites. First, Los Alamos, New Mexico, a dusty mesa chosen for its remoteness. This would be the brain of the project, where theoretical physics met practical engineering. Here, Oppenheimer assembled a dream team of scientists: Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Enrico Fermi, and dozens of others. Many were European émigrés fleeing fascism. Some had no idea what they were truly building. Second, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where entire factories as long as several football fields were built from scratch. Their mission? Enrich uranium, one of the two elements needed for an atomic bomb. The problem was uranium-235 was incredibly rare, less than 1% of natural uranium. So engineers tried everything. Gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, even calatrons. Thousands of workers, most of them women, operated machinery they didn't understand, never knowing they were helping enrich bomb fuel. Third, Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was bred. This was the second path to the bomb. Plutonium didn't occur naturally in usable amounts, but in huge nuclear reactors built in the middle of nowhere. Uranium could be bombarded to produce it. Then it had to be extracted, refined, and shipped to Los Alamos for weaponization. The reactors ran around the clock, creating a new element and new nightmares. Radiation leaks, contamination, and the birth of the nuclear age's environmental costs all began here. Over 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, more than the population of some U.S. states at the time. They built secret towns, complete with housing, schools, stores, and security fences. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Workers were told only what they needed to know. Even Vice President Harry Truman had no idea what the project was until he became president. This wasn't just a science project. It was industrial, military, bureaucratic, and deeply human. People fell in love, gave birth, and suffered accidents. Got bored and died, all in service of an invention they couldn't name. The project had become a hidden America, and it was inching closer day by day to building the deadliest weapon in history. J. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't your typical military contractor. He wasn't even a typical scientist. Brilliant, erratic, aristocratic, and deeply philosophical. Oppenheimer spoke 6 languages, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, and smoked constantly. He had a sharp tongue, fragile health, and an uncanny ability to solve theoretical puzzles that stumped everyone else. To many, he seemed more poet than physicist, but under pressure, he was the glue that held Los Alamos together. Appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project by General Groves, Oppenheimer quickly proved he was more than just an academic. He had an intuitive understanding of people and politics. He could inspire loyalty and manage egos. No small feat considering he was working with some of the most brilliant minds on Earth, each with a Nobel Prize-level intellect and a reputation to match. But he also had a dark side. Oppenheimer's earlier associations with Communist Party members, including his brother and his mistress, Jean Tatlock, raised red flags for military intelligence. Groves overruled objections and pushed ahead with Oppenheimer anyway, but the file on him was thick and getting thicker. Still, Oppenheimer's ability to visualize how theoretical physics could become physical machinery made him indispensable. At Los Alamos, he led with a mix of charisma and obsession, often sleeping just a few hours a night. He'd race between chalkboards and meetings, scribbling formulas, arguing designs, and chain smoking until dawn. He was at the center of everything. Atomic configurations, bomb casing designs, neutron reflectors, even the seating charts at briefings. He was also painfully aware of the consequences. Oppenheimer believed beating the Nazis to the bomb was morally necessary. But as the war in Europe neared its end and Germany's nuclear program collapsed, he grew uneasy. The bomb was no longer just a defensive weapon. It was becoming a political weapon. This paradox haunted him. He had summoned the greatest minds of the age to unleash destruction, never before imagined. Every success brought them closer not to victory, but to a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. In private, Oppenheimer remained conflicted. In public, he remained focused. As the team finalized bomb designs, one chilling truth grew clear. They wouldn't just be changing warfare, they'd be changing the nature of humanity's relationship with power itself by late 1944. Theory had given way to blueprints. Blueprints became parts. Parts became prototypes. The Manhattan Project was no longer an experiment. It was an assembly line for Armageddon. But building a nuclear bomb wasn't like building a tank or a plane. This was uncharted territory, and nothing came easy. Engineers, machinists, and physicists at Los Alamos were now focused on two types of bombs, each with its own terrifying complexity. The first was the uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy. It relied on the principle of a gun-type mechanism. Fire one chunk of uranium-235 into another at high speed and you get a chain reaction. Simple in concept, horrifying in practice. The enriched uranium came from Oak Ridge, Tennessee in tiny, hard-earned quantities. Each gram took enormous effort, and they needed over 60 kilograms. Every calculation had to be perfect. There would be no test run. The Little Boy would go straight to the battlefield. The second bomb, Fat Man, used plutonium. But plutonium was trickier. A gun-type design wouldn't work. Plutonium would pre-detonate, fizzling out before it reached full power. Instead, they had to develop a completely different method, implosion. This meant precisely timed explosive lenses would compress a plutonium core into a critical mass in microseconds. It was like trying to crush a steel ball evenly from all sides using dynamite without cracking the shell. To make matters worse, plutonium was toxic, unstable, and newly invented. The scientists worked under extreme secrecy and stress. Accidents happened. In 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian accidentally dropped a tungsten brick into a plutonium core, initiating a critical reaction. He absorbed a lethal dose of radiation and died weeks later. The Demon Core, as it was called, would kill another scientist, Louis Slotin, months later in an eerily similar accident. Every step forward carried a cost physically, mentally, and morally. Meanwhile, time was running out. Germany had surrendered, Japan fought on, and Washington wanted results. The scientists at Los Alamos knew what they were making, but not where it would go or who it would kill. Inside the workshops, the final pieces were coming together. Metal casings, precision detonators, nuclear cores, each component a marvel of science. Together, they would form humanity's most lethal invention. The only thing left now was to test it. Not in theory, not in simulation, in fire, in desert. In real life, on July 16, 1945, at precisely 5:29 a.m., the New Mexico desert turned into the birthplace of the nuclear age. The test was codenamed Trinity, and it was the first detonation of a nuclear device in human history. The bomb they tested was a plutonium implosion design, the same type as Fat Man. It had never been tested before, unlike Little Boy, which the scientists believed would work based on simple physics. Fat Man's complex implosion mechanism made it unpredictable. It could fail, it could fizzle, or it could destroy everything around them. Tension ran high. Oppenheimer, Groves, and hundreds of scientists gathered at observation points miles from the detonation site. Many wore welding goggles. Some had sunscreen smeared on their faces, hoping it would protect them from the unknown light that was about to be born. Others took bets on whether the blast would ignite the atmosphere. It sounds absurd now, but back then they genuinely weren't sure. At the exact moment of detonation, the desert exploded with a flash brighter than the sun. The shockwave knocked people off their feet. The heat could be felt over 10 miles away. A mushroom cloud soared 40,000 feet into the sky. The earth itself seemed to pause. One observer described it as being present at the birth of the world. Another said it felt like the gates of hell had opened. Oppenheimer didn't cheer. He whispered a line from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am dead, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a success, a terrifying, undeniable success. It confirmed that the United States now possessed a weapon that could annihilate entire cities in seconds, but it also marked the beginning of a profound moral reckoning. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded glass like sand, now called trinitite, formed at ground zero. But what lingered most wasn't scientific data. It was silence, and the haunting awareness that mankind had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. News of the test was kept tightly sealed. President Truman, then attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, was informed via a coded message. The baby is born. The war was still raging in the Pacific. Japan had not yet surrendered. And now the United States held the power of annihilation. The question wasn't if they would use it. It was where and when. Less than a month after the Trinity test, the theoretical horror became a real one. The United States had 2 working bombs and a fateful decision to make. On August 6, 1945, an AB-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island. Its payload? Little boy, the uranium bomb. The target? Hiroshima, a city of military importance, but also full of civilians. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. 43 seconds later, the sky erupted. The explosion leveled 5 square miles of the city. Temperatures reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the epicenter. Over 70,000 people died instantly, vaporized or crushed. Fires raged. Survivors, burned and blinded, stumbled through a nightmare landscape of twisted steel and ash. In the following weeks, tens of thousands more would die from radiation sickness, injuries, and trauma. The world had never seen destruction like this, and yet the war continued. Japan's leaders hesitated. Some wanted surrender, others wanted terms. The U.S., interpreting silence as resistance, prepared a second strike. On August 9th, the plutonium bomb Fat Man was loaded onto another B-29 boxcar. The primary target was Kokura, but cloud cover forced a change. The bomb was dropped over Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. The terrain of Nagasaki limited the blast somewhat, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Around 40,000 people died instantly. The blast obliterated factories, homes, temples. Once again, thousands more would succumb in the following days from burns, trauma, and radiation. Within hours, the Japanese cabinet convened in chaos. The emperor himself, Hirohito, intervened. For the first time in history, a Japanese emperor spoke directly to his people, announcing unconditional surrender. The war was over, but the debate had just begun. Did the bombs end the war, or did they usher in something worse? Were they necessary or a horrific show of force? Some scientists had begged for a demonstration instead of a city strike. Their pleas were ignored. Others, like General Groves, felt no remorse at all. The world had entered a new reality, one where peace was enforced by the threat of absolute destruction. The bomb had done its job militarily, but morally, philosophically, spiritually. Those questions would echo for generations. What was undeniable? In 2 flashes of light, the 20th century had split. There was the world before the bomb and everything that came after. The mushroom clouds had barely settled before the world, and especially those involved began to wrestle with what had just happened. At Los Alamos, the celebrations were muted. Yes, the bomb had worked. Yes, the war was over, but the scale of devastation stunned even those who had built it. Photos of charred bodies and flattened cities reached the laboratories. Survivors' stories trickled in. Scientists who once poured their genius into making the weapon now stared into an ethical abyss. Many felt they'd unleashed something far bigger than they understood. Oppenheimer, in particular, was shattered. Though once the charismatic heart of the Manhattan Project, he was now a man haunted. In a meeting with President Truman shortly after the war, he reportedly said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, according to his staff, was disgusted. He later called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist. But the ethical crisis wasn't confined to one man. Scientists like Leo Szilard and James Frank circulated petitions urging transparency and international control of nuclear weapons. They warned that secrecy and unchecked arsenals would lead to an arms race. Their reports were ignored. Instead, the U.S. tightened control over nuclear research. The Atomic Energy Commission was formed. The Cold War began to simmer, and the Soviets, already aware of the Manhattan Project thanks to extensive espionage, were racing to build a bomb of their own. Meanwhile, many Manhattan Project workers, especially those at Oak Ridge and Hanford, began to learn, often for the first time, what they had been a part of. Some were proud, others were horrified. The public, too, was split. American newspapers cheered the end of the war, but slowly images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to appear. Questions followed. Could Japan have been forced to surrender another way? Were both bombs necessary? Was this justice or vengeance? And then came the reality of radiation. Survivors of the bombings, Hibakusha, as they came to be known, suffered burns, cancers, miscarriages, and lifelong stigma. Fallout studies began. The long-term toll wasn't just physical. It was generational DNA damage, birth defects, psychological trauma. The war had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. The Manhattan Project had achieved its goal but left behind a legacy of sorrow, secrecy, and ethical confusion that would define the nuclear age. Science had broken through a barrier, but humanity hadn't caught up while the bomb was being built in secret deserts and hidden labs. It wasn't as secret as the U.S. government had hoped. Even as America celebrated its newfound atomic dominance, cracks in its security had already begun to widen, and Soviet agents had already slipped through. The Manhattan Project had been compromised from nearly the beginning. Thanks to Soviet espionage networks, the USSR knew about the bomb long before it was dropped. Key scientists, including Klaus Fuchs, a theoretical physicist working at Los Alamos, were quietly funneling details of the weapon's design straight to Moscow. Fuchs's information was so precise that Soviet engineers later admitted they used his data as a template when building their own bomb. He wasn't alone. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American civilians with communist ties, were accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Their eventual trial and execution in 1953 shocked the nation and became one of the most controversial episodes in Cold War history. Whether they were scapegoats or genuine traitors remains debated, but the message was clear. The nuclear genie was out and no longer in just one country's hands. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima. It was faster than most American officials had expected. The world was now a multi-nuclear landscape, and the arms race was officially on. America's monopoly on ultimate destruction had lasted less than half a decade. What followed was a new kind of warfare, not of bullets, but of brinkmanship. Nations now held weapons that could annihilate cities with a single strike. The logic of conflict shifted. Victory no longer meant who had more troops. It meant who could survive a nuclear first strike or deliver a deadlier one in return. Back in the U.S., paranoia grew. Loyalty oaths, background checks, black hearings, the Red Scare. Scientists who had once been hailed as national heroes found themselves accused, blacklisted, and interrogated. Oppenheimer himself, the father of the bomb, was stripped of his security clearance in a humiliating hearing that exposed how deeply the political climate had changed. The bomb had won a war, but it had also ignited a new one, colder, more psychological, and infinitely more dangerous. From the labs of Los Alamos to the gulags of Siberia, a new era had begun, one where silence, suspicion, and surveillance reigned, and the threat of total annihilation would never be far behind. The Manhattan Project ended in 1946, but its impact never did. It reshaped the world scientifically, militarily, politically, and morally. It was, in many ways, the birth of the modern era. On one hand, the project marked an unprecedented scientific achievement. It proved that theoretical physics could shape global events, that pure research could transform into raw power. The same principles that split atoms would go on to power nuclear energy, guide space exploration, and advance medicine. Nuclear physics became a cornerstone of modern science. On the other hand, it introduced a permanent shadow over humanity. The invention of nuclear weapons didn't just end a war, it redefined peace. For the first time in history, humans had created something that could wipe themselves out entirely. That terrifying possibility has hovered over every international conflict since. The concept of mutually assured destruction became the twisted backbone of Cold War diplomacy. Two superpowers, armed to the teeth, locked in a stalemate where pulling the trigger meant the end of civilization. The Manhattan Project also sparked a global arms race. The US, the Soviet Union, then Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel unofficially, and later North Korea each developed their own bombs. What began as a desperate gamble to stop Nazi Germany became a blueprint for global militarization. And yet, for all its devastation, the bomb has only been used in war twice. That fact alone is both chilling and remarkable. It suggests a paradox. The bomb is the ultimate weapon, and its horror may be the very reason it hasn't been used again. Culturally, the Manhattan Project left scars. In film, literature, and philosophy, it forced a confrontation with the limits of progress. Could science exist without conscience? Could knowledge be separated from responsibility? Figures like Oppenheimer remain icons of that dilemma. Neither villain nor hero, just human, caught between brilliance and guilt, ambition and regret. In 1965, he reflected in some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish. The physicists have known sin today. The legacy of the Manhattan Project lives on in weapons stockpiles, in non-proliferation treaties, in a climate of deterrence, and in the uneasy peace that nuclear fear enforces. The bomb ended a world war, but it began something else too. A permanent, fragile era where the fate of the world can hinge on the press of a button in ancient Mesopotamia. What you wore wasn't just about covering your body, it was about broadcasting your identity. Your class, occupation, gender, and even your closeness to the gods were reflected in your clothing. Fashion here was an elaborate code, and everyone from priest-kings to slaves was expected to follow it. The earliest civilizations in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria developed distinct clothing hierarchies for men. Garments ranged from simple skirts made of wool or flax to long, elaborately fringed robes. These robes were symbols of status. The more layers, pleats, and embroidery you had, the more powerful you were perceived to be. Royalty and nobility often favored cloaks dyed with expensive pigments, deep reds, purples, and indigos extracted from rare minerals and plants. These dyes weren't just visually striking, they were costly to produce. So wearing them shouted wealth and authority. Women's clothing was no less symbolic. Elite women wore finely woven gowns that wrapped diagonally across the body and often left one shoulder bare. Decorative fringes along the hems were a recurring feature. Jewelry was essential. Gold necklaces, lapis lazuli earrings, and carnelian beads were used not only to enhance beauty, but to signify divine favor or aristocratic lineage. Bracelets, anklets, and hairpieces reflected both spiritual beliefs and marital status. Even hairstyles were strategic. Mesopotamian men took pride in their beards, which were curled, oiled, and sometimes crimped into intricate patterns. Beards were not just facial hair. They were a badge of masculinity and wisdom. Women, meanwhile, styled their hair in buns, braids, and elaborate rolls. Wigs were worn by both sexes on ceremonial occasions, or by the upper classes to show refinement. Perfumes and cosmetics added the final layer. Oils scented with myrrh or cedar were commonly used to anoint the skin. A makeup, often kohl, was applied not only for beauty, but for protection against evil spirits and the sun's glare. And let's not forget shoes or the lack thereof. Most Mesopotamians went barefoot, but elites sometimes wore sandals made of leather or even silver purely for ceremony. In Mesopotamia, fashion wasn't frivolous. It was deeply functional, symbolic, and enforced by religious and political institutions. What you wore could elevate you or condemn you. Even 5,000 years ago, people knew appearances weren't just skin deep, they were destiny. In ancient Egypt, fashion served a divine function. What you wore didn't just signal wealth or taste, it reflected your connection to the gods. Clothing was about purity, power, and eternal style. And in a land where life and death were closely intertwined, your wardrobe had to be fit for both this world and the next. Linen was king. Derived from flax, it was the primary fabric for all Egyptians, soft, lightweight, and perfect for the desert heat. But not all linen was equal. The upper class wore finely woven, almost transparent linen that clung to the body in elegant folds. Pharaohs and nobility wore pleated kilts and robes with ornate sashes, often starched and shaped to dramatic effect. The whiter and finer the linen, the more it symbolized purity and favor with the gods. For women, fashion was both sensual and symbolic. Elite women wore sheath dresses known as calasiris. They were tight-fitting and often supported with shoulder straps. These dresses left little to the imagination, but in Egyptian culture, beauty and fertility were divine virtues. Clothing was designed to highlight the natural form. Modesty, as we know it today, wasn't the goal. Harmony and sacred aesthetics were. Jewelry was more than adornment. It was spiritual armor, amulets shaped like scarabs' tanks, and the eyes of Horus were common. Gold was the preferred metal of the gods, believed to be incorruptible. Necklaces like the broad collar or Wessex were worn by both genders and layered with precious stones, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. These weren't just pretty, they offered protection and favor from the divine. Wigs were a daily fashion choice for elites. While most Egyptians shaved their heads for hygiene and to ward off lice, wigs made of human hair or plant fibers signaled rank and beauty. Some were enormous, intricately braided and perfumed with cones of scented wax that melted in the heat, releasing fragrance throughout the day. Makeup was essential. Kohl eyeliner wasn't just stylish, it protected the eyes from the sun's glare and was believed to ward off evil spirits. Men and women both wore green malachite eyeshadow and red ochre lip stain. Looking good was serious business because the gods were always watching. From pyramid workers to priests to queens, what you wore in Egypt wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a sacred statement about your status, your soul, and your journey into eternity. At first glance, ancient Greek fashion might seem simple, flowing fabrics, minimal seams, and clean lines. But look closer and you'll see a world coded with identity, status, and civic values. In Greece, especially during the classical period, clothing wasn't about extravagance. It was about order, proportion, and philosophy. Literally, Greek garments were typically made from rectangular pieces of wool or linen, artfully draped and pinned rather than cut or tailored. The most iconic outfit was the chiton, a tunic fastened at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Men's chitons were usually knee-length, while women's reached the ankles, but even that length was a message. Long chitons on men signaled youth or priesthood, while short ones meant athleticism, labor, or military life. Over the chiton, both genders might wear a high maton, a large cloak draped over one shoulder. Philosophers famously wore it wrapped tightly, creating a dignified, severe look that mirrored their Stoic ideals. The himation became a silent advertisement for intellect and civic virtue. Women also wore the peplos, a heavier woolen garment folded over at the top, creating a double layer across the torso. This fold, called the epoptygma, was both decorative and symbolic. It highlighted modesty and femininity, ideals prized in Athenian society. The way a woman wore her peplos could signal her marital status, her mourning, or even her alignment with religious festivals. Color played a subtle but important role. White was associated with purity and ceremony. Dark garments were worn during mourning. Saffron yellow and rich purples, though rare and expensive, appear during special rituals or in elite households. Patterns were minimal, but geometric borders and embroidery along the hem or neckline added visual weight and social distinction. Hair and accessories were carefully curated. Men often kept their hair short, while women's hairstyles varied widely. Braids, buns, and curls all had their season. Jewelry was elegant but restrained. Gold earrings, intricate hairpins, and bracelets shaped like snakes or leaves. Shoes were optional. Many Greeks went barefoot at home or during ritual events when they did wear footwear. It was typically simple leather sandals or soft boots. Form met function. Greek fashion was elegance through discipline. In a society obsessed with balance and virtue, the drape of a tunic or the tie of a sash wasn't just aesthetic. It was a reflection of how one lived, thought, and contributed to the polis. If the Greeks used fashion to express ideals, the Romans used it to display dominance. Roman clothing was bold, regulated and highly symbolic, designed to reflect the empire's strict social hierarchy and its love for spectacle and control. What you wore in Rome wasn't just a personal choice. It was often a legal requirement. The most iconic Roman garment was the toga, and it wasn't for comfort. Reserved for Roman male citizens only, especially the elite, the toga was a massive, semicircular woolen cloth draped intricately over the body. It required practice, or a personal slave to wear properly. The color, size, and decorative stripe of your toga immediately signaled your status. A toga virilis, plain and white, was worn by adult male citizens. A toga praetexta with a purple border was for magistrates and high-ranking boys. The fully purple toga picta, embellished with gold, was reserved for generals in triumphal processions and eventually. Emperors to wear the wrong toga could result in public disgrace, or worse. Underneath, men wore a tunica, a simpler knee-length garment belted at the waist. Slaves wore rough, undyed tunics. Freedmen might wear striped versions to distinguish their new, albeit limited, status. Senators had a purple stripe called a latus clavus down the front. Fashion in Rome wasn't about individualism. It was about knowing your place. Roman women, meanwhile, wore the stola, a long, flowing dress, often paired with a pallor, a shawl that could cover the head in public. Respectable matrons wore distinct stoles as a badge of their chastity and virtue. Prostitutes, by contrast, were banned from wearing them, a literal fashion divide between dignity and disgrace. Jewelry was abundant, especially among women. Rings, necklaces, fibulae, brooches, and earrings were not just decorations. They were currency, status markers, and political gifts. Wealthy women wore elaborate hairstyles, often piled high with curls, braids, and pins, a fashion that required both a mirror and several servants. Footwear ranged from simple sandals to leather boots dyed red, green, or black. Senators even had their own shoe style, the calceus, marked by a black leather finish and laces across the ankle. In Rome, clothing was law, art, and propaganda rolled into one. To be dressed appropriately was to embody Rome's values: discipline, hierarchy, conquest, and civic pride. A toga wasn't just cloth, it was the Roman Republic draped in wool. In the Achaemenid Persian Empire, fashion was nothing short of regal theater. From Darius the Great to Xerxes, Persian rulers dressed not merely to impress, but to intimidate. To see a Persian nobleman walk into a room was to witness a human jewel box shimmering in embroidered silks, gold ornaments, and divine iconography. Clothing here was about power, but also about cosmology. Unlike the more minimalist Greeks, Persians embraced vivid colors and luxurious textures. Silk, which reached Persia via early trade routes, was reserved for the elite. Embroidery was everything. Tunics and robes were heavily decorated with gold thread, mythical animal motifs, and elaborate patterns symbolizing fertility, protection, and divine favor. The more detailed your garment, the higher your position, and the closer your aura was to the king. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics with trousers underneath, innovative for the time. Unlike other ancient societies where robes dominated, Persians adopted fitted pants for both practicality and fashion. It was revolutionary and would later influence Greek, Roman, and even medieval dress. A wide ornate belt often cinched the tunic at the waist, while layered cloaks draped across the shoulders added weight and formality. Women's fashion was equally refined, though more modest by design. Long dresses with fitted bodices and multiple layers of fabric were common, along with wide sleeves and veils. Jewelry was abundant, gold necklaces, gemstone bracelets, and intricately carved rings. Perfume and cosmetics also featured heavily. Women wore rouge, kohl eyeliner, and scented oils stored in elegant alabaster jars. Headgear was critical. The tiara or kadaras, a tall, pointed headdress, often decorated with pearls or embroidery, it was a signature of Persian royalty. Even lower-ranked courtiers wore embroidered caps or turbans as a sign of affiliation and loyalty to the king. The more elaborate your headgear, the closer you were to the throne. Colors had meaning, too. Deep blues and purples were reserved for royalty and high nobility. White represented purity and was often worn by priests during sacred rituals. Red and gold were symbols of fire, the sacred element of Zoroastrianism, Persia's dominant faith. Persian fashion was never accidental. Every fold, every gem, every stitched griffin or lion carried a message. The cosmos is ordered, the king is divine, and you, based on your clothes, better know your place in it. In ancient India, fashion was an art form tied intimately to religion, climate, and cosmic balance. From the Vedic period through the Maurya and Gupta empires, Indian clothing reflected a deep philosophical worldview where texture, color, and drapery were not just aesthetic, but sacred. The cornerstone of ancient Indian fashion was unstitched cloth. Instead of tailoring, garments were wrapped, folded, and draped in a variety of regional and symbolic styles. This wasn't a shortcut, it was a principle in Hindu belief. Stitching was sometimes considered impure for ritual wear, so flowing fabrics became the canvas of self-expression and spiritual identity. For men, the most common garment was the dhoti, a rectangular piece of cloth, often white or saffron, wrapped around the waist and tied in a knot. It could be formal or casual, and the style of folding differed by region and caste priest, for example. Wore it in specific ritual folds that aligned with religious ceremonies. Women wore the sari, still famous today, but in ancient times it looked quite different. It was usually a single piece of cloth, up to 9 yards long, wrapped around the waist with one end, a pallu draped over the shoulder or head. It left the midriff bare, not as a fashion statement, but as a gesture of fertility and cosmic openness in many temples. Goddesses were adorned in this exact style, reflecting the sacred femininity of the land. The koli, the blouse worn under a sari, emerged later in history. In earlier periods, upper body coverings varied greatly depending on social norms and climate. In some areas, especially in southern India, women wore the sari without a blouse at all, while in colder regions shawls and veils were added. Textiles were India's pride. Cotton was first cultivated here, and Indian weavers mastered techniques like block printing, resist dyeing, and fine spinning. The muslin of Bengal was so delicate it was called woven air. Silk too was a staple of royal and sacred attire, especially in Buddhist and Jain traditions. Jewelry was worn by all classes: necklaces, bangles, anklets, nose rings. Each piece had astrological, spiritual, or marital meaning. Even children wore talismans to ward off evil. In ancient India, fashion was not bound by fast-changing trends. It was a living philosophy, soft, unstitched, layered in meaning, and always attuned to the divine. In ancient China, fashion was far more than decoration. It was a living system of ethics, cosmology, and imperial order, whether during the Shang, Zhou, or Han dynasties. What you wore was a reflection of your social role, your harmony with the universe, and your relationship to the emperor. The most iconic garment in early Chinese history was the hanfu, a flowing robe with wide sleeves, a cross collar, and a sash at the waist. It wasn't just a fashion staple, it was a visual embodiment of Confucian ideals. Modesty, structure, and respect for hierarchy were sewn into every pleat. Men and women alike wore hanfu, but the details, color, fabric, trim, and length differed dramatically based on class, age, and occasion. Colors were strictly regulated. Under the Zhou dynasty, color codes were established to align with the 5 elements of philosophy. Yellow for earth, center; red for fire; blue-green for wood; white for metal; west and black for water. And yellow was especially sacred, reserved for the emperor alone. To wear it as a commoner was a direct insult to the throne. Layering was key. Nobles and scholars wore multiple robes atop one another, not just for warmth or beauty, but as a symbol of refinement. The more layers, the more elevated your rank. Peasants, by contrast, wore simple tunics made of hemp or coarse wool belted at the waist with trousers or leggings. Silk was strictly the domain of the upper class, until its production expanded centuries later. Women's attire varied, but generally echoed the Hanfu silhouette with added sashes, flowing skirts, and elaborate hairpins. Hair is always styled with care, long and pinned up, often with jade combs, gold ornaments, or floral motifs. The higher and more intricate the hairstyle, the greater the refinement. Hair left loose in public was considered improper for women past childhood. Accessories were laden with meaning. Jade in particular was seen as the stone of immortality and virtue. Pendants carved with dragons, phoenixes, or clouds symbolized blessings and moral strength. Even shoes had codes. Pointed tips or elevated soles distinguished the refined from the rustic. In ancient China, fashion was harmony in fabric form. It reflected the natural order, expressed human dignity, and upheld the invisible scaffolding of the empire. To dress properly wasn't just courteous, it was a civic and spiritual duty. To Romanus, the fashion of Celtic and Germanic tribes was wild, impractical, and savage. But to the people who wore it, their clothing wasn't just practical, it was powerfully expressive. Tribal dress reflected warrior culture, kinship, spiritual belief, and a love for bold identity. Where Mediterranean fashion emphasized order and hierarchy, the so-called barbarians leaned into individuality and flair. Let's start with the Celts. Spread across Gaul, the British Isles, and parts of Central Europe, Celtic men and women wore brightly colored woolen garments, often dyed with natural pigments from plants and minerals. Patterns were a big deal. Plaids and checks weren't just decorative, they were tribal identifiers. Each region or clan had its preferred style. Centuries before Scotland's tartan system developed, men typically wore long-sleeved tunics belted at the waist with trousers known as bracca, a radical departure from the robe-based attire of Rome or Greece. These trousers were warm, flexible, and ideal for horseback riding and combat. Warriors often went shirtless into battle. Covered in tattoos or blue war paint made from wood, a nod to both intimidation and sacred ritual, Celtic women wore layered dresses or skirts with shawls or cloaks fastened by elaborate brooches called fibulae. Jewelry was worn in abundance, thick neck rings called torques, bangles, spiral earrings, and amber beads. These items weren't just for show. They marked wealth, tribal role, and sometimes even mystical protection. Hair was another statement. Both men and women braided or coiled their hair, sometimes bleaching it with lime for dramatic effect. Long-styled mustaches and beards were favored by men, especially among warriors and chieftains. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes, from the Goths to the Saxons, had similar clothing strategies. Tunics, wool cloaks, and layered furs dominated their wardrobes. Animals' hide, often worn as capes or trimmed with teeth and claws, were both status symbols and talismans. Metalwork on belts, clasps, and weapons often featured motifs of wolves, boars, and eagles, creatures believed to hold spiritual power. Though dismissed as uncivilized by Roman historians, these tribal fashions were deeply meaningful. They emphasized mobility, identity, and a spiritual connection to the land and ancestors. In a world of constant migration and warfare, what you wore was your flag, your shield, and your mythology, stitched into wool, leather, and bone. By the time the Roman Empire evolved into the Byzantine Empire, fashion had become something altogether different, a fusion of Roman authority, Eastern luxury, and Christian symbolism. In Byzantium, clothing wasn't just about status or wealth. It was a sacred language. Every thread, every jewel, every embroidered icon was part of a divine and political performance. The Byzantine court was obsessed with ceremonial dress. The emperor, seen as God's representative on earth, wore garments so intricate and heavily adorned they bordered on the theatrical. His robes, known as the loros, were long jewel-studded bands wrapped elaborately around the body. Gold thread was common. Pearls, sapphires, and garnets were stitched directly into the fabric. To see the emperor was to behold a living icon. Color was strictly regulated. Purple, dyed from the rare murex snail, was the exclusive right of the imperial family. Anyone else caught wearing it could face severe punishment. Even small accents of purple on robes or shoes indicated a connection to the throne. Senators, clergy, and generals had their own color codes, and uniform-like outfits for ceremonies. Byzantine fashion was layered and modest. Both men and women wore tunics called dalmatica, with wide sleeves and embroidered bands known as clavi running vertically down the front. Over these they wore cloaks like the chlamys, fastened with ornate brooches, often shaped like crosses or doves. These layers weren't just practical. They reflected religious values of humility and decorum. Women's fashion in Byzantium was both opulent and devout. Elite women wore long-sleeved robes with tight cuffs, heavily patterned silk fabrics, and elaborate head coverings. Veils and crowns signaled both piety and power. Jewelry was plentiful. Heavy earrings, multi-strand necklaces, and golden belts adorned with religious icons and saints. Even their shoes were embroidered. Christianity influenced everything. Angels and sacred inscriptions appeared on belts, pins, and borders of garments. Churches were filled with mosaics depicting saints and royalty in dazzling robes. Real fashion immortalized in art. Even outside the palace, fashion mimicked the hierarchy. Merchants, scholars, monks, and servants all had clearly defined clothing styles. You didn't just dress for the weather, you dressed for your role in God's order in Byzantium. Fashion wasn't a choice. It was destiny, sanctified by scripture and stitched in silk. Your robe wasn't just a garment, it was your gospel. Before eyeglasses were invented, poor vision was a life sentence, often with serious consequences. If you were nearsighted, reading or fine craftsmanship became nearly impossible. If you were far-sighted, sewing, carving, or copying manuscripts was a daily struggle. And yet, for most of human history, there was no solution, just quiet resignation. Ancient civilizations recognized vision problems, but they didn't have the means to fix them. The earliest written reference to impaired vision comes from ancient Egypt. Medical papyri from as early as 1500 BCE describe symptoms that sound a lot like presbyopia, age-related farsightedness, but treatment was largely magical or herbal. There's no evidence of any optical devices. The Greeks and Romans, too, understood that eyesight could decline with age. Seneca the Younger, in the 1st century CE, reportedly used a glass globe filled with water to magnify text. It worked like a crude magnifying lens, but it wasn't wearable. The first true magnifying lenses came from the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad and Cairo were experimenting with optics as early as the 9th century. The mathematician Al-Hazen, also known as Ibn al-Haytham, wrote the Book of Optics in the 11th century, laying the groundwork for the science of vision. He described how light enters the eye and how lenses could bend it. But again, there's no record of wearable lenses. Instead, ancient and medieval readers used what were known as reading stones, polished hemispheres of glass or crystal placed directly over the text to enlarge it. These tools date back to around the 10th or 11th century in Europe and the Middle East. They were useful, but clunky. You had to press them against the page, and they only helped with one line at a time. The true revolution came in the late 13th century in northern Italy, likely in the artisan hubs of Pisa or Venice. It was here that craftsmen began producing the first wearable eyeglasses, turning magnifying lenses from stationary tools into something portable and transformative. These early glasses weren't stylish, but they were revolutionary. For the first time in human history, failing eyesight didn't mean the end of a scholar's or artisan's career. The earliest eyeglasses were convex lenses designed to help with presbyopia, age-related farsightedness, which makes reading up close difficult. These were not mass-produced. Each pair was handcrafted by skilled glassmakers and mounted in simple frames made of wood, bone, leather, or metal. There were no temples. These lenses were balanced on the nose or pinched together, sometimes held by hand. The earliest written reference comes from 1306, when a Dominican friar named Giordano de Pisa famously told his congregation that it is not yet 20 years since there was found the art of making eyeglasses, so that one can read and do fine work. That places the invention somewhere around. In the 1280s, Venetian glassmakers, already masters of fine crystal, played a key role. Their work in Murano, an island dedicated to glassmaking, led to clearer, more uniform lenses. It wasn't long before eyeglasses became a quiet but vital tool for monks, copyists, and aging scholars. These early spectacles weren't personalized. There are no eye exams. Buyers simply tested out lenses to see which one helped the most. The concept of nearsightedness, myopia, wasn't fully understood yet, so lenses for distance vision wouldn't appear for another few centuries. Still, the cultural impact was enormous. In a society that valued literacy, learning, and religious scholarship, eyeglasses gave older individuals a second life. Monks could continue copying texts. Doctors could read anatomical diagrams. Artists could keep painting intricate details. Aging no longer meant fading into uselessness. The invention spread rapidly across Europe, mostly among clergy and the educated elite. Glasses were expensive, and illiteracy was still widespread, so their use was limited. But word of their utility traveled quickly. By the early 14th century, eyeglasses had reached Germany, France, and England. A simple tool, two lenses and a frame, had changed the course of human productivity. For the first time, vision loss was not a final chapter. It was a problem with a solution. As the 14th and 15th centuries rolled on, eyeglasses moved beyond monasteries and into the bustling hands of Europe's growing middle class. The invention of spectacles coincided with the rise of literacy, trade, and urban life, and with it, eyeglasses evolved from obscure scholarly tools to everyday commercial goods, accessible, portable, and increasingly practical. Thanks to the rise of towns and guilds, more people were learning to read, merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats among them. Reading contracts, ledgers, and inventories required good close-up vision. Presbyopia, still the most common visual issue addressed by spectacles, no longer sidelined older professionals. In a world driven by writing and math, eyeglasses became a silent partner in economic expansion. By the 15th century, eyeglasses were being sold by peddlers, apothecaries, and even St. vendors. These were rudimentary models, simple convex lenses mounted in wire or horn frames, held in place by pinching the nose or tying cords around a head. They weren't comfortable, but they worked for many. It was the first time their world came into clear focus in decades. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press changed everything. Suddenly, books could be produced by the hundreds, and later by the thousands. As printed material flooded Europe, the demand for eyeglasses surged. Literacy rates crept upward, and with them, the need for vision correction. Glasses became more than a scholarly aid. They became tools for the new information age. Eyeglass manufacturing began to specialize. In Nuremberg, Germany, spectacle makers formed one of the first dedicated guilds by the late 15th century. Venice and Florence also became centers of lens production, combining advances in glass clarity with craftsmanship in frame making. These early opticians didn't conduct eye exams, but they developed a range of lenses with differing strengths. Buyers would simply try out lenses at market stalls to find one that suited their needs. The role of glasses in social perception also began to shift. At first, spectacles were a symbol of learning and age. Paintings from the Renaissance often depicted saints, scholars, or apostles in eyeglasses, an emblem of wisdom and spiritual focus. But as the middle class embraced them, glasses also became a sign of literacy, professionalism, and commercial savvy. Eyeglasses were no longer elite curiosities. They were becoming something more radical, useful, widespread, and essential. The 17th century brought a seismic shift in how people understood vision. It wasn't just about practicality anymore. It was about physics. This was the age of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, men who not only gazed at the stars, but also cracked open the science behind how light and lenses work. Their discoveries forever changed both astronomy and optics, pushing eyeglasses from folk craft to scientific instruments. Johannes Kepler's work in 1604, Ad Vitellianum Parallelumina, laid the foundation for modern optics. He was the first to explain how convex and concave lenses corrected vision, differentiating between myopia, nearsightedness, and hyperopia, farsightedness. For the first time, eyeglass lenses could be understood in terms of precise light refraction, not just trial and error. Meanwhile, Galileo used modified lenses to build the first practical telescope. Others applied similar methods to microscopes. These developments turned humble reading lenses into tools for exploring the universe and the invisible. The same glass that helped someone read a book was now helping humans read the stars and the cell. This new understanding of optics influenced eyeglass makers. With growing knowledge about focal lengths and lens curvature, opticians began crafting more precise corrective lenses. the profession started to professionalize. Spectacle makers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam began referring to themselves as opticians, a term rooted in science, not just trade. Eyeglass frames also saw subtle improvements. While many were still clunky and nose-pinched, some began to include leather nose pads, riveted hinges, or short handles known as temples. Early attempts to anchor glasses more securely. In China, eyeglasses with looped silk cords tied around the ears were already in use, and Europeans slowly adopted similar innovations. Another major leap, concave lenses for nearsightedness became more common. Previously, most glasses only helped far-sighted individuals, but as understanding of vision disorders grew, so did the range of corrective options. For the first time, a nearsighted young person could wear glasses to see clearly at a distance, expanding the use of spectacles beyond the elderly and scholarly. By the end of the 1600s, eyeglasses had entered a new era. They weren't just functional, they were evidence of Enlightenment thinking. Grounded in physics, driven by curiosity, and shaped by expanding literacy, eyeglasses stood at the intersection of utility and discovery. From now on, improving eyesight would be a matter of science, not just chance. By the 18th century, eyeglasses had not only become more accessible, they had started to become fashionable, no longer confined to the desks of scholars or the toolkits of tradesmen. Spectacles found their way into salons, courts, and coffee houses. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and refinement, gave rise to a world where intellect was trendy, and so were the tools that symbolized it. Frame design began to improve dramatically. Gone were the awkward nose-pinched contraptions of the Middle Ages. In their place came temple spectacles, glasses with arms that extended over the ears, similar to what we wear today. Invented around the 1720s, these arms made glasses far more stable and comfortable, especially for everyday use. They were sometimes hinged, sometimes made of flexible wire, and often wrapped in silk or ribbon for extra flair. Materials diversified. Frames were crafted from tortoiseshell, horn, silver, and even gold. The elite could commission custom spectacles, complete with engraving or jeweled accents, while function remained important. Form was catching up fast. Public figures helped normalize glasses. Benjamin Franklin, perhaps the most famous bespectacled man of the era, not only wore them, but revolutionized them. In the 1780s, he invented bifocals, cutting two different lenses in half and combining them into one frame, so he wouldn't have to switch between reading and distance glasses. It was a practical innovation with lasting impact. At the same time, portable eyewear became popular. The quizzing glass, a single magnifying lens with a handle, became a fashionable accessory among the upper class, especially in Britain and France. People would wear them on a chain around the neck and use them at social gatherings, less for actual vision correction and more to make a statement of wit, wealth, or curiosity. Then came the lorgnette, a pair of spectacles with a handle, popular among aristocratic women. It could be elegantly flicked open and held up for reading or viewing opera performances. For many, it wasn't just about seeing clearly. It was about being seen. Eyeglasses in the 18th century had become markers of sophistication, intellect, and even flirtation. No longer a quiet sign of aging or infirmity, spectacles had joined the fashion world. They now framed more than eyes. They framed identity. The 19th century brought spectacles to the masses. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution came not just steam engines and factories, but total transformation in how eyeglasses were made, sold, and worn. What had once been artisan-crafted accessories for the few became mass-produced necessities for the many. Before industrialization, glasses were mostly made by hand, one pair at a time. But new machinery allowed for the consistent production of lenses and frames on a large scale. Glass cutting, metal shaping, and lens grinding became faster and more precise. This meant more people could afford glasses and more could finally see clearly. By the mid-1800s, eyeglasses were available in general stores and even by mail-order catalog. You didn't need to visit an optician anymore. Instead, people would test pre-made lenses on their own, trying on different strengths until they found one that worked. While this was far from personalized eye care, it was a giant leap forward in accessibility. Frame styles also expanded. Steel, nickel, and celluloid, and early plastic, became popular materials, replacing more expensive horn or tortoise shells. The classic pane, a nose-clamping style with no temples, was trendy among both intellectuals and fashion-conscious gentlemen. Meanwhile, Round wire rim glasses, made famous later by figures like Gandhi and John Lennon, became a staple for professionals and students. For the first time, children's eyewear entered the market. As public education spread and literacy soared, so too did the need for vision correction among school-age kids. Teachers and parents began recognizing that struggling to read a blackboard or book might not mean laziness. It might just mean nearsightedness. Medical understanding of the eye also advanced. Ophthalmology became a formal field, and eye exams began to standardize. In 1862, German ophthalmologist Hermann Snellen created the Snellen chart, the familiar wall chart with rows of shrinking letters, revolutionizing how vision was measured. Meanwhile, glasses became more acceptable in public. In earlier centuries, many hid their need for spectacles out of embarrassment. But in the 19th century, wearing glasses became a sign of seriousness, education, and rising middle-class respectability. Glasses were practical, but also professional. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was clearer than it had ever been. Glasses were everywhere, in classrooms, factories, courtrooms, and newspapers. Sight had become industrialized, and vision, for the first time in history, was mass-marketed. As the 20th century dawned, eyeglasses were no longer just corrective tools. They were a cultural force. This was the century where vision met identity, where fashion collided with science, and where spectacles became as personal as fingerprints. It was also the beginning of a technological arms race in optics, one that would define modern eye care. In the early 1900s, wire-rimmed glasses remained popular, especially for intellectuals and professionals. But mass production continued to evolve, and with it came new styles, shapes, and materials. By the 1920s and 1930s, celluloid and other plastics allowed for bolder frames, giving rise to more expressive eyewear. Thick black rims became associated with confidence and authority. Eyeglasses were no longer something to hide, they were something to show off. Hollywood played a pivotal role. Actors like Harold Lloyd, who wore round horn-rimmed glasses, made spectacles part of his signature look. Later, stars like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Audrey Hepburn wore glasses both on and off screen, glasses that emphasized their personality, not their impairments. During World War II, innovation accelerated. Military demand for better optics led to advancements in lens durability, anti-reflective coatings, and lightweight frame design. The military also issued standardized glasses, nicknamed GI glasses, or less affectionately, birth control glasses for soldiers. These weren't flattering, but they were durable and accessible. In 1958, a huge leap occurred, the invention of plastic lenses. Lighter and safer than glass, they changed the comfort game entirely, combined with the development of photochromic lenses. While it darkens in sunlight, glasses became more versatile for everyday wear. Then came contact lenses. Though invented earlier, it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that soft contacts became commercially viable. Suddenly, people had a choice. You could wear glasses or not. Meanwhile, fashion exploded. The 1960s saw cat-eye frames and mod-inspired colors. The 70s brought oversized aviators. The 80s were all about big, bold statements. Think Run DMC and Wall Street executives. And by the 90s, minimalist styles returned, with rimless and wire frames ruling boardrooms and universities alike. Eyeglasses were no longer just tools for sight. They were statements of politics, of intellect, of rebellion, of style. Whether you were a beat poet in Greenwich Village or a Silicon Valley coder, your glasses said something about who you were. The 20th century didn't just correct vision, it reframed it. The 21st century brought eyeglasses into a whole new frontier, the digital world. As screens became our constant companions on our desks, in our pockets, even on our wrists, our eyes began to pay the price. And so eyewear had to evolve once again. From medical marvel to fashion staple to high-tech necessity, glasses became smarter, lighter, and more personalized than ever before. One of the most significant developments has been the rise of digital lens crafting. Unlike earlier eras where lenses were molded from preset prescriptions, modern glasses are now shaped with computer-guided precision. This allows for customized lenses tailored to your exact eye measurements, head tilt, reading distance, and more. Progressive lenses, which offer a seamless blend between near, middle, and far vision, have improved dramatically, eliminating the dizzying distortions that plagued early designs. Another innovation, blue light blocking technology. As people began spending 810 or even 12 hours a day staring at screens, reports of digital eye strain skyrocketed. Dry eyes, headaches, blurred vision. This became the new normal. Lens companies responded by developing coatings that filter out high-energy blue light, reducing fatigue and improving sleep for some users. Whether or not the science is conclusive, demand has soared. Frame technology also leapt forward. Ultralight materials like titanium, memory, metal, and carbon fiber made glasses more durable and comfortable. Some frames are now so thin and featherlight wearers forget they're even on. Others integrate flexible hinges, hypoallergenic coatings, and modular designs for personalization. Then came smart glasses. While early attempts like Google Glass had a rocky start, met with both awe and backlash, the concept of augmented eyewear hasn't disappeared. Modern versions now include audio capabilities, camera integration, fitness tracking, and even heads-up displays. Companies continue refining the balance between function and style, hoping to make smart glasses an everyday accessory. Eyewear retail has changed too. Online platforms now let users upload a selfie, try on frames virtually, and receive prescription lenses without ever entering a store. This democratization of access, combined with stylish branding, has turned glasses into a booming e-commerce industry. And let's not forget fashion. From hipster round frames to sleek minimalism to vintage revivals, glasses today are expressions of identity more than ever. In the digital age, glasses don't just help you see, they help you filter, protect, compute, and express exactly who you are. As we peer into the future of eyeglasses, the lines between technology, biology, and fashion continue to blur. We're now entering an era where correcting vision is just the beginning, where glasses might enhance human ability, serve as wearable computers, or eventually disappear altogether. The future isn't just about seeing better, it's about seeing differently. One of the most promising frontiers is smart eyewear. Companies like Meta, Apple, and Amazon are racing to develop glasses that integrate seamlessly with augmented reality AR. The idea is to overlay digital information, navigation, and notifications, translations, even 3D objects onto your field of view, all without taking out a phone. These devices aim to do what smartphones did for communication, make it instant, invisible, and immersive. At the same time, prescription lenses are getting even more advanced. Some companies are experimenting with adaptive lenses that adjust focal length automatically. No more bifocals. No more switching glasses with liquid crystal or electrochromic technology. These lenses can respond to your gaze, lighting conditions, or visual needs in real time. Medical technology is also taking bold steps forward. Gene therapies and stem cell treatments for certain types of blindness are showing promise in early trials. Bionic eyes, once a science fiction fantasy, are already in development, with retinal implants and brain-computer interfaces aiming to restore partial vision to the blind if these technologies mature. Eyeglasses might shift from corrective tools to transitional devices, eventually replaced by internal or neural solutions. But the humble eyeglass frame isn't going away just yet. In fact, fashion continues to keep glasses relevant, even as they become more high-tech. Designers are blending tradition with futurism, 3D printed frames, recycle materials, modular designs, and customizable colors. Are all glasses personal and wearable? Meanwhile, virtual reality headsets, once bulky and awkward, are slimming down, borrowing heavily from optical science to create immersive experiences in sleek, goggle-like form. These too, in a sense, are the spiritual successors of the lens. What started as a monk's reading aid in 13th century, Italy has now become a gateway to digital worlds, a medical marvel, and a cultural icon. The story of eyeglasses isn't just about helping us see the world more clearly. It's about how the world has come to see us, and how that vision continues to evolve one lens at a time. You wake up, or more accurately, you regain consciousness in a space barely large enough to turn around without elbowing a wall. Congratulations, you live in a cellar, the ancient Roman version of a work-from-home setup. If your home was a broom closet, and your job required body oil, these rooms were standard issue for many of Rome's working women. Located in brothels, lopinas, or stacked above taverns and bathhouses, They were tiny, windowless chambers that doubled as both living quarters and workspace. Think of it as a studio apartment designed by someone who hates light, air, and privacy. Your mattress is straw-stuffed, possibly shared with fleas, and smells faintly of wine, smoke, and disappointment. If you're lucky, there's a small oil lamp. If you're really lucky, it hasn't been stolen. Your few possessions, some cheap makeup, a comb, and maybe a bronze mirror if times are good, are shoved into the corner like they too are tired of being here. There's no running water. There's no plumbing. There's a bucket you try not to think about. Bathing. That'll be a group activity later at the nearest public bathhouse, where the water is communal and the awkward eye contact is free. But there's no time to lounge because your room is also your office. And business hours are whenever someone knocks or barges in or yells through the door. Yes, privacy is a modern concept. Here in Rome, walls are suggestions and doors are decorative. Most days begin with a quick clean up of the room. Sweep out yesterday's dust, wine stains, and any lost sandals left behind by last night's visitors. Then comes the prep, face powder, rouge, and enough perfume to qualify as flammable. You're not trying to smell good. You're trying to smell better than the guy in line behind you. You practice your best sultry half-smile in the bronze mirror. Not because it works, but because pretending helps. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you're still riding the emotional high from that. Because here in the cellar, every day begins the same cramped, rushed, and filled with just enough dignity to make it to lunchtime. After waking up in your glorified broom closet, it's time to prepare for another day of impressing clients and surviving public judgment. But first, hygiene, or what passed for it in ancient Rome. There is, of course, no private bathroom. That luxury is reserved for the wealthy, and even they just had pots with ambition as a working girl in a city that worships marble statues but accepts open sewers. Your best option is the nearest public fountain or bathhouse, depending on your mood and threshold for awkward nudity. If you're pressed for time, and let's face it, you usually are, you go for the quick rinse at the communal fountain. Splash some water on your face, rinse out your mouth with wine if you're fancy, and hope the fountain hasn't been used to clean a chicken that morning. There's no soap, but maybe you've got a bit of Natron, a salty cleaning powder that exfoliates your skin and your self-esteem. If business is slow and coins are jangling in your little purse, you might splurge on a visit to the public baths, the great Roman equalizer. Everyone's there. Merchants, soldiers, philosophers, and that guy who talks too loudly about his hemorrhoids. You undress, store your belongings in a niche you trust way too easily, and wade into tepid water full of floating philosophical debates and someone else's toenail. Inside, you sweat in the steam room, scrape yourself with a strigil, a curved metal blade, and enjoy a brief moment of being the cleanest person in your street, a title that lasts about 5 minutes. After the bath, you dry off, apply more perfume, and try to remember if anyone's invented deodorant yet. They haven't finished the look. A bit of chalk-based face powder, a hint of rouge for the cheeks and lips, and kohl around the eyes. Not to highlight your beauty, to hide the fatigue. Clients don't want to see the woman who's already dealt with 3 senators and a sailor before noon. They want mystery, allure, and someone who doesn't smell like old lentils. Now that you're washed, or at least convincingly perfumed, it's time to get dressed. And while Roman society had a lot of complicated opinions about fashion, there was one outfit that made things very clear. The female toga. Yes, toga, that flowing white garment we usually associate with senators, emperors, and frat parties. But here's the twist. In Rome, a woman wearing a toga wasn't making a political statement. She was making a professional one. It was a visual billboard for, I'm not a respectable matron, and I am available for negotiation. Proper Roman women wore the stola, a long layered dress that said my husband controls my dowry and I go to bed at 9 o'clock. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were denied the stola by law and required to wear a toga, often short, brightly colored, and intentionally flashy. Think less Grecian goddess, more visible from across the forum. The look was usually accessorized with cheap jewelry, bronze or glass beads, maybe some loud earrings. The goal wasn't elegance, it was visibility. When you're competing with 20 other women in a 100-meter radius, Subtlety is a luxury you can't afford. Footwear, likely simple sandals, maybe even barefoot, depending on location and budget. Comfort wasn't a priority. You're going to spend a lot of the day standing, walking, and occasionally sprinting away from a bad client or an overzealous moralist. Hair was its own ordeal. Roman prostitutes often curled and dyed their hair, sometimes wearing wigs, especially blonde ones imported from Gaul. Blonde hair had a certain exotic appeal in Rome, kind of like imported luxury soap, only more alive. And let's not forget the finishing touches of makeup. Pale face powder to contrast with red lips and cheeks and thick kohl eyeliner to make your eyes pop, or at least look less sleep-deprived. Once fully dressed, you looked obvious, and that was the point. In a city of 1 million people, your outfit was your business card. If it made you look bold, scandalous, and economically available, then congratulations. You were ready for another glorious day of being judged by society while being actively funded by it. So you're dressed, painted, perfumed, and hopefully not too hungover. Now comes the fun part, drumming up business in a city where everyone wants sex but pretends they're shocked when they find out it's for sale. In ancient Rome, marketing wasn't subtle. There were no pamphlets, no websites, and definitely no branding consultants. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, or be immortalized in graffiti, preferably all three. Let's start with the location strategy. If you worked out of a Lupanar brothel, your office was already built for visibility. Brothels were often located near bathhouses, markets, or drinking establishments. In short, anywhere people might already be sweaty, bored, or easily persuaded. Think ancient foot traffic optimization. Standing in the doorway, wearing your finest look-at-me outfit, you'd call out to passers-by with a mixture of flattery, negotiation, and time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick. I might sound desperate, but hey, rent was due, and the next girl over just dropped her rate to 1. If you were freelance, it was all about roaming visibility. You might hover near temples, because nothing says divine inspiration like temptation or hanging around taverns ready to flirt with a tipsy legionary who still had some coin left and questionable judgment. But perhaps the most bizarre and weirdly effective form of Roman advertising, wall graffiti. Yes, Pompeii has immortalized the genius of ancientity. Marketing. Brothel walls were plastered with handwritten reviews like Maridamus gave me the best time of my life, or Felicia to Denaria, very fast service. These weren't just vandalism. They were ancient Yelp, unfiltered, unregulated, and very, very public. Some women even paid someone to write their name and specialty somewhere visible, usually near tavern entrances or on columns. Others let their clients do the writing, which, as you might expect, ranged from glowing praise to confused haikus about being robbed. All this made one thing clear. A prostitute's survival depended as much on marketing as on skill. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and your approximate level of enthusiasm, someone else was getting the business. Because in ancient Rome, as now, the secret to success wasn't always talent. Sometimes it was just better PR. So you've advertised yourself. You've got the outfit, the eyeliner, and just enough confidence to fake a good mood. Now it's time to talk pricing, the part where ancient Rome pretends to be a free market while secretly judging you anyway. Let's be clear, there was no union. Rates were set by supply, demand, and whatever you could get away with before someone bartered you down with a loaf of stale bread for street-level workers or those in lower-end luminaries. Prices could be as low as 1 or 2 asses a small bronze coin that wouldn't even get you a glass of wine. That's right, some clients were paying less than the cost of a decent lunch. If that feels depressing, remember some women accepted food, sandals, or even promises as payment. Yes, in a city with an empire's worth of coinage, a use still existed. On the other hand, high-end prostitutes, often called mere traces, operated more like luxury brands. These women could charge in denarii silver coins, sometimes multiple per client, especially if they had skills beyond the bedroom. Conversation, music, poetry, basic literacy, anything that let a client believe they weren't just hiring a company, but taste. Some prostitutes even had niches, not architectural ones, marketing ones. Maybe you specialized in working with sailors, or performing erotic dances, or reciting poetry during the act. Don't laugh. Ovid probably inspired someone. The more unique your brand, the less replaceable you become. Repeat clients might get a discount or not. It depended entirely on whether they paid on time or smelled like fermented cabbage. And if you worked under a pimp or brothel owner, a hefty cut of your earnings disappeared before you saw a single coin. Some women were enslaved, which meant they didn't get paid at all. Just food, shelter, and a vague promise that one day they might buy their freedom if they somehow won a Roman lottery. Welcome to the Lupanar, the Roman brothel. It's not luxurious, but it has walls, which already makes it more dignified than working behind a tavern. Technically, it's a place of business. Realistically, it's a sweaty stone maze of bad decisions. The term lupanar comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, which the Romans used as slang for prostitute. That's right, your job title was also your animal comparison. Not exactly empowering, but at least it's consistent. Most lupanars were two-story buildings crammed between bathhouses and bars, perfect for catching foot traffic from half-drunk senators and bored sailors. Inside, you've got a narrow hallway lined with tiny rooms, each equipped with a stone bed, a thin mattress, and just enough space to reconsider your life choices. No doors, just curtains for that open floor plan vibe. Privacy. That's something rich matrons had. You've got damp linen and the sound of someone snoring through your shift wall. You're not alone, of course. A proper lupanar had several working women and one delightful parasite known as the Leno pimp or Lena. Madam. Their job was to take a cut of your earnings, promise repairs that never happened, and occasionally yell things like work faster. He's important. Clients ranged from nervous teenagers to sweaty legionaries and balding senators, claiming this was just a philosophical visit. Some were in and out faster than a drop denarius. Others tried to talk about their poetry, which frankly was worse. During downtime, you'd sit near the entrance, giving your best. I'm flirty but dead inside expression while calling out to passing foot traffic. Marketing was mostly volume-based. 2 coins are special today. I'll pretend to listen. And yes, the walls were covered in graffiti. Ancient Yelp reviews etched lovingly into the plaster. Felix was here twice or Ties had a good time. Occasionally someone got artsy and drew pictures. Proportions were rarely accurate. Confidence, however, was never lacking. Working in a lupanar wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. A roof over your head, bet if you squint, and if nothing else, you'd always have a front row seat to humanity's weirdest parade. Not every Roman prostitute worked in a lupanar. Some preferred or were assigned to the equally glamorous world of taverns if the brothel was a chaotic office cubicle. The tavern was more like working in an open-air startup, with more vomit and fewer stock options. Taverns, Colpini or Popini, were where Rome's finest drunkards, merchants, off-duty soldiers, and guys named Gaius with gambling debts gathered to drink, shout, and pretend they understood Virgil. For prostitutes working here, the motto was simple. Serve the wine, sell the charm, dodge the gross. A typical shift involved pouring watered-down wine into dirty cups for people who wouldn't notice the difference anyway. With your other hand, you flirted just enough to keep the denarii flowing, but not so much that a brawl broke out, unless that brawl was entertaining, in which case carry on. Unlike the brothel, taverns were technically food establishments, so you had the delightful backdrop of boiled cabbage, fish sauce, and body odor. It was an aroma that clung to your tunic and your soul, but it also meant you could upsell a client. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't reek of garum. Some women worked the back rooms or upstairs areas, making the tavern a part-time brothel with table service. Others kept things more casual, offering company, lap-sitting, and heavily suggestive compliments like your toga looks clean. This was high praise in Rome. Payment was often immediate. Credit did not exist. If a client tried to delay, you had options. Yell, threaten, or grab the bouncer, who was usually a retired gladiator with one eye and a short temper. The upside? Taverns offered more foot traffic, and sometimes better tips. The downside? You were a waitress, therapist, and hostage negotiator all at once, and no one tipped for emotional labor. And of course, there was the endless soundtrack. Shouting, dice clacking, liar players trying to impress women, and the occasional argument over who invented democracy. Working tavern duty was unpredictable, exhausting, and smelled like despair. But it paid the bills sometimes if the customers didn't vomit on your sandal first. For the entrepreneurial spirit, with no brothel affiliation and too much confidence, there was always the street. Freelance prostitution in Rome meant walking the line between independent contractor and please don't arrest me. The Roman streets were alive with opportunity and sewage. Prostitutes who worked outdoors were called prostabuli, and they roamed the alleys, bathhouse entrances, marketplaces, and occasionally temple steps because nothing says divine intervention like offering a discount outside a shrine to Venus. Daylight hours were decent for traffic, but risky. You had to navigate gawking citizens, nosy magistrates, and angry matrons who thought your existence was ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler: it wasn't. You dressed brightly to stand out. Think short tunics, flashy jewelry, maybe a wig made from imported German hair. It was less understated elegance, more visible from across the Circus Maximus. The goal was to catch a client's eye before his wife caught him. Approaching a potential customer involved a delicate dance of flirtation, timing, and not getting mistaken for someone's runaway slave. You'd smile, compliment his sandals, and casually mention your rate before the local vigilantes, street guards, decided your entrepreneurialism was a public disorder. Some clients were polite, others were aggressively cheap, and a few were very confused and just wanted directions to the bathhouse. You learned quickly to tell them apart, mostly by the level of eye contact and how many coins they jingled. Competition was fierce. You weren't just up against fellow prostibuli. You were up against free lovers, drunken party girls, and retired gladiators with a side hustle. Everyone was trying to make a denarius. There were no benefits, no security, just your charm, your wits, and the ability to walk very fast in sandals. Some carried small knives or relied on nearby tavern bouncers. Others simply prayed that tonight's customers weren't philosophers with commitment issues. Still, for all its chaos, the street scene had its advantages. You set your own hours, kept your own profits, and didn't have to answer to a lino breathing down your neck. Sure, the job came with the occasional drunk goat or philosophical heckler, but at least you were your own boss. In a city where bosses were rarely the good guys, if you thought the life of a Roman prostitute was already tough, allow us to introduce your least favorite client, the Roman tax collector. Yes, the Roman Empire, brilliant engineers, conquerors of the Mediterranean, champions of togas also invented a dedicated tax on prostitutes. It was called the Vectigul ex Capturis, and it ensured that even your most awkward encounters contributed to Rome's public infrastructure. Congratulations, your nightly services just funded another aqueduct. The tax wasn't just unofficial pocket skimming either. This was a state-sanctioned system managed by professional collectors known as publicani, men who were somehow both boring and terrifying. They kept detailed records, demanded payment in cash, and probably judged your perfume choices while scribbling on their wax tablets. To legally operate, prostitutes had to register with the aediles, the Roman equivalent of a city inspector, with an affinity for paperwork and moral superiority. Upon registration, you were entered into an official list of sex workers. Think of it as joining a trade union, except there were no benefits. And instead of a card, you got a branding. Literally. Yes, some sex workers, especially enslaved ones, were branded or tattooed with marks like lupa or their owner's name. If you're wondering how that made clients feel, don't worry. The branding wasn't for them. It was to ensure you couldn't pretend to be respectable later. And the tax rate. It varied depending on location, class, and whether your clients were sad senators or discount gladiators. But it always stung. You paid per act or per week, depending on the region. And there was no deduction for emotional labor, uncomfortable silences, or existential dread. Refusing to pay could result in fines, arrest, or being barred from working, though enforcement was spotty, especially if you were paying under the table or knew how to flirt with an aerial. Still, for a profession already swimming in stigma, this tax added insult to injury. Rome was essentially saying we disapprove of your lifestyle. Also give us 10%. But hey, on the bright side, at least you could proudly say your labor was helping to fund another temple, probably dedicated to a goddess who still wouldn't return your prayers. In Rome, Being a prostitute meant you had legal permission to exist and social permission to be endlessly judged. Yes, prostitution was tolerated by the law, taxed, regulated, even registered. But that didn't stop every senator, priest, and bored philosopher from telling you how much they disapproved of you, often while zipping up their tunic. Enter the moral police, not an official squad with batons, but a vast unpaid network of senators, priests, matrons, and writers who all believed it was their divine duty to shame you while enjoying the fruits of your labor behind closed doors. At the top of the hypocrisy food chain was the Roman Senate, a group of aging elites who believed in preserving Roman virtue, a concept they typically defined as whatever we're not caught doing. Many of them publicly railed against moral decay while maintaining discreet tabs at every brothel from the Forum to Suburra. Then you had the aediles, Rome's actual public officials who enforced laws on cleanliness, order, and decency. Their job was to regulate brothels, inspect establishments, and sometimes fine women for being too obvious about their profession, which again was legally required to be obvious. You couldn't make it subtle if you tried. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca had a field day. They mocked prostitutes in verse, lumping them in with greedy merchants, loud women, and horror of horrors, women who read books. And yet these same writers gave vivid, suspiciously detailed descriptions of brothel life, almost as if they'd done extensive research. Even Roman matrons, the respectable wives of the elite, got in on the judgment. They wouldn't speak to you, of course, but they'd walk past your street corner with a gaze that could sterilize a fig tree. Some even petitioned for laws banning prostitutes from wearing jewelry or entering public baths, which is rich considering many of their husbands treated bathhouse visits like part-time jobs. Working as a Roman prostitute came with certain occupational hazards, namely disease, injury, and whatever that thing was, the sailor from Brundisium left behind. Welcome to the health and wellness chapter, where the only prescription is hope you survive. Let's begin with the big one, venereal disease. Ancient Rome didn't have germ theory, but they did know that some men left you with more than a coin purse and a bad palm. There are Roman texts that describe symptoms ranging from persistent itching to things falling off that shouldn't. Medical advice? Usually a mix of vinegar washes, herbal ointments, and desperate prayers to Venus. Pregnancy was another ever-present concern. There was no birth control pill, but there were options if you had the guts and the budget. Prostitutes used natural contraceptives like silphium, an extinct plant famously over-harvested for this exact reason. Animal intestines as crude condoms, and wool tampons soaked in herbal concoctions. Effectiveness somewhere between maybe and miracle. If pregnancy occurred, things got complicated. Some women carried to term and raised their children, often within the brothel itself. Others gave infants up to foundling homes or worse, the open streets. Infanticide wasn't legal, but turning a blind eye, that was practically a civic duty for day-to-day ailments, sore muscles, cuts, stress-induced rage, blackouts. The go-to remedy was usually wine, opium, or a slap from your Lena to stop whining. If that fails, you might visit the temple of Asclepius and sleep on the floor hoping for a healing dream. Ancient wellness culture was less spa weekend and more mystical nap with side effects. Infections were common. Hygiene was ambitious. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, and absolutely no one washing their hands before sticking fingers where fingers had no business being. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Depression, trauma, anxiety, all part of the job. Rome didn't have therapists. You had fellow prostitutes, wine, and the occasional stray cat who listened without judgment. In a city where divine intervention was blamed for everything from floods to flatulence, prostitutes weren't just dodging moral judgment. They were also trying to stay on the gods' good side, or at least bribe them for health, luck, and a low-maintenance clientele. Religion in Rome was a full-time job, and the gods were always watching, judging, occasionally cursing. But the divine pantheon had a few deities who were, let's say, more lenient towards your profession. First, there was Venus, goddess of love, beauty, and general poor decision-making. Many prostitutes dedicated small altars to her in their rooms. Offerings of flowers, perfume, or a coin were made in hopes of attracting wealth, charm, or at the very least, clients who didn't smell like boiled goats. Then came Fortuna, goddess of luck. Given how random your daily income was, ranging from a gold bracelet to 3 moldy grapes and a promise, Fortuna was kind of a big deal. You might wear a charm bearing her likeness, or mumble a quick prayer before a customer with too many rings and suspiciously clean sandals walked in. But religion wasn't all glitter and flirtation. The darker side of belief included superstition, omens, and magical countermeasures. Because when in doubt, blame the spirits. You'd burn incense to ward off the evil eye, tie red cords around your ankle for protection, or hire a professional to curse a rival prostitute's hairline. Don't laugh. Cursed tablets called the fictions have been found all over Roman brothel districts, many reading like ancient Yelp revenge reviews. May her tongue rot. May her clients dry up. May she trip in the street and land in donkey dung. If you were enslaved, you might also pray to Mercury, the god of commerce and transactions. Because, let's be honest, your life was one long receipt, and if you were lucky enough to save up for freedom, Libertas, the goddess of liberty, got a private altar and a slightly more expensive candle. All this spiritual effort wasn't just tradition, it was survival with flair. When Rome gave you judgment, disease, and rude senators, the gods were your HR department. Mostly useless, occasionally helpful, and always accepting offerings. Love in the Roman world of prostitution was complicated. At best, it was a pleasant delusion, and at worst, a financial liability in a tunic. Clients fell in love all the time, or claimed they did, usually after 3 cups of wine and half a monologue about their mother. Some were sincere, some were drunk, and some were trying to get a discount. But baby, I'm different, they'd say, clutching your hand like a tragic poet. And you'd nod politely, mentally calculating how much they still owed you. Some working women reciprocated these feelings, or at least pretended to. Emotional labor was part of the package. Smile, listen. Pretend his toga doesn't smell like despair. For a few clients, you might even develop some real attachment, affection, or just mutual exhaustion. But more often than not, romance was a dangerous distraction, especially when you remembered that Rome legally categorized you as infamous, meaning you could not legally marry a citizen even if you wanted to. That didn't stop people from trying. There are tales of prostitutes who fell in love with their regulars, who were promised freedom, marriage, a house with a garden, only to end up abandoned the moment another woman with better eyeliner walked by. There were also clients who genuinely adored their favorite companion, showering them with gifts, poems, and occasionally actual manumission, the legal act of freeing a slave. These stories exist, but they were the exception, not the rule. Among fellow prostitutes, real bonds were more likely. You worked side by side, endured the same insults, shared the same lice. Some of these friendships became sisterhoods. Others became quiet, romantic partnerships hidden beneath the radar of Roman patriarchy, which believed women couldn't fall in love with anyone except a man with a sword collection. And of course, there were lies you told yourself that one day you'd quit, that your best client really would take you away. If you could just save a little more, you'd open a perfume shop in Ostia and never look back. Maybe it wasn't true, but in Rome, everyone had a fantasy. Yours just came with better lighting and lower expectations. In the Roman world of sex work, beauty was currency and youth was the exchange rate. So what happened when the blush wore off, the client stopped lingering, and your joints started popping louder than your earrings? Simple. You aged out, but you didn't disappear. Some women, having saved carefully or miraculously, had a client with both money and follow-through, managed to buy their freedom if they were enslaved and start over. The luckiest opened taverns or bathhouses, renting out rooms to the next generation of desperate optimists. Others became madams. Line, the brothel version of upper management. Less action, more shouting. As a learner, you don't need to be young or pretty. You needed to be sharp, intimidating, and fluent in threats involving sandals and overdue debts. You ran the schedules, kept the books, and made sure the curtains were only mildly horrifying. Clients feared you. Workers pretended to respect you. The adults sighed when they saw you coming. Other retired sex workers leaned into fortune-telling. After all, when you've heard every confession and watched every mistake walk through the door, predicting doom becomes second nature. A few became unofficial therapists, wise women or herbalists, offering advice laced with sarcasm and slightly incorrect medical suggestions. But many simply kept working because Rome wasn't in the habit of offering pensions to women who'd spent 2 decades in a toga. Older prostitutes still had clients, they just adjusted their marketing. Less blushing flower, more experienced, discreet, and tolerates poetry. Physical appearance mattered. but so did reputation. A woman known for conversation, kindness, or mind-blowing astrology readings could remain in demand long after her prime. And for those with no savings, no patrons, and no lucky breaks, the options weren't kind. You begged. You cleaned temples. You worked in laundries until your hands turned into shriveled olives. Rome didn't care how you got old, only that you did so quietly. But here's the truth. They didn't carve into marble. For many, survival itself was an achievement. And if you made it to old age with your wit intact, and at least one working sandal, you were already a legend. When people think of ancient Rome, they picture marble statues, grand speeches, and emperors with questionable family trees. They rarely picture the woman leaning in a brothel doorway, adjusting her wig, and mentally calculating how many coins she needs to not starve next week. Roman prostitutes didn't just work in the shadows. They've been kept there by history, carefully edited out of the noble narrative so schoolchildren could learn about aqueducts without asking uncomfortable questions. Yet they were everywhere in graffiti, legal records, satire, poems, love letters, curse tablets, and receipts. Yes, actual receipts. They were a fixture of daily Roman life, even as society treated them like morally contagious wallpaper. What history usually gets wrong is the assumption that these women were powerless victims or morally bankrupt seductresses. In reality, many were savvy, adaptable, and dare we say, better at business than half the Senate. They knew how to read a client, negotiate terms, avoid danger, and hustle a living in a city that cheered gladiators and stoned anyone who wore the wrong shoes. And they weren't all the same. Some were enslaved, some free, some catered to the wealthy, others to whoever had 2 coins and bad breath. Some hated every second. Others carved out small corners of power and routine. Most existed somewhere in between, like everyone else in Rome, pretending they weren't tired. Their stories were rarely written by them. Instead, they were remembered by poets looking for metaphors, by moralists clutching their pearls, or by archaeologists piecing together Pompeii's racist wall scribbles. But here's what's remarkable. They're still visible in stone carvings, in sarcastic graffiti, in laws and loopholes and offhand mentions in love poems. These women were erased from respectability, but not from reality. They worked, they laughed, they scammed, they wept, and they endured, all without marble statues or gilded tombs, just faint ink on a crumbling wall. Meridema was here and worth every coin. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the glory of Rome, remember, behind every toga-clad philosopher was a working girl keeping the economy and the gossip alive. In the world of the Vikings, warfare was a constant presence, and with it came injuries. Deep cuts from swords, axe wounds, broken bones, and burns from fire and frost on the battlefield or back in village. It was the Lechner, the healer, who was called upon to treat the wounded. These individuals were respected members of society, combining the practical knowledge of herbs with the spiritual traditions of Norse belief. Among the most trusted herbs in a Viking healer's collection was Yarrow Achillea millefolium. Known for its ability to staunch bleeding, yarrow was used widely across northern Europe. Viking healers would crush the leaves and apply them directly to wounds, either alone or mixed into a poultice. Yarrow acted as a coagulant, helping to stop blood flow and prevent infection. It was believed to possess sacred properties, with legends connecting its power to Odin himself. The preparation of such remedies was both methodical and rooted in cultural ritual. The healer might wash the wound with boiled water infused with antiseptic herbs, apply crushed yarrow, and bind the area tightly with linen or animal skin strips. In some cases, chants or prayers were recited during the process, invoking protection or healing from the gods. Healing was not just physical, it was also spiritual. Beyond battlefield wounds, yarrow was used internally as well. A tea made from its flowers and leaves could reduce fevers, ease digestive complaints, or help relieve menstrual cramps. It was a versatile plant and one that could be found growing throughout the Viking homelands, in fields, near rivers, or in small garden plots maintained by women of the household. Healers in Viking society had a deep understanding of their environment. They knew which plants grew in which seasons, how to harvest them properly, and how to preserve them for use during the long, dark winters. Knowledge was passed down through generations, often from mother to daughter or from elder to apprentice. These traditions blended elements of Germanic herbal lore with the rich cosmology of Norse mythology. In a world without hospitals or modern antibiotics, the skill of the healer and the power of plants like yarrow were essential to survival and to maintaining strength in a warrior-driven culture, while yarrow addressed bleeding and surface wounds. The Viking healer's battle against infection required deeper remedies. One of the most revered herbs in this regard was Angelica archangelica, a tall aromatic plant with hollow stalks and umbrella-shaped clusters of greenish-white flowers. It thrived in the cold climates of Scandinavia and was considered so valuable that it was cultivated in monastery gardens long after the Viking Age ended. Angelica held a central place in early Northern European medicine, prized for its broad-spectrum medicinal properties. Viking healers used the root, leaves, and seed to prepare a variety of treatments. Most commonly, the root was dried and then steeped into decoctions to fight internal infections. It was known for its warming effect on the body and was used to stimulate circulation, cleanse the blood, and reduce inflammation. The antiseptic properties of Angelica were vital in treating infected wounds, especially those that had been neglected or exposed to dirt and decay. A healer might grind a root and mix it with animal fat or beeswax to create salve, then apply it to festering injuries. When ingested as a tea or tincture, Angelica helped combat respiratory infections, fevers, and digestive issues, ailments that could become life-threatening in a time without antibiotics. But Angelica's power extended beyond physical healing. In Norse cosmology, certain plants were believed to carry divine energy. The name Angelica itself, though Latin in origin, echoes the spiritual reverence surrounding the plant. In Christianized Europe, it was said to have been revealed by an angel to cure the plague. While Viking belief systems were different, they too held that some plants were gifts from the gods. It is likely that Angelica, with its strong scent and dramatic appearance, it was associated with protection and sacred power. Women, who often served as herbalists within a household, used Angelica to treat gynecological conditions. It was thought to regulate menstrual cycles and ease childbirth, a dangerous and sacred moment in Norse society. Because of its reputation as a purifier, Angelica was also used in smoke rituals to cleanse homes and ward off disease during times of illness. In every Viking community, from remote farms to coastal trading towns, Angelica was a cornerstone of natural medicine. Its effectiveness and symbolic weight made it a trusted ally in the healer's quest to preserve life in a harsh and unpredictable world. As spring arrived in the Viking world, it brought with it one of the most vital remedies for fever and fatigue, birch sap. The birch tree, widespread across Scandinavia, it was more than just a source of wood. It was a living pharmacy. Vikings tapped the tree in early spring, collecting the clear, slightly sweet sap as it rose from the roots to nourish new leaves. This seasonal practice required skill and timing, as the sap could only be harvested for a short period before the tree fully awakened. Healers used birch sap as a tonic for those weakened by long winters, illness, or lingering fevers. It was served fresh or fermented into a lightly alcoholic drink known for its revitalizing qualities. Rich in minerals, electrolytes, and natural sugars, birch sap helps rehydrate the body and restore lost energy, especially after the depletion caused by sickness or extended fasting. In an era without formal nutrition science, Viking healers recognized the restorative power of this gift from nature in cases of fever. Healers often paired birch sap with infusions of cooling herbs such as meadowsweet or elderflower. This gentle combination helped bring down body temperature while nourishing the patient. In more serious cases, the sap might be mixed with bitter herbs like wormwood to purge the body of what was believed to be harmful humors. The logic was simple: cleanse, restore, and rebalance. Beyond its internal uses, the birch tree had a role in external treatments too. The bark, when boiled, produced a tar-like substance with antiseptic properties. It was used to treat skin infections, minor burns, and bites. Birch leaves were also used in poultices and steam baths to draw out toxins from the body, often accompanied by prayer or ritual to align the physical with the spiritual. Symbolically, the birch tree represented renewal and purity. It was often the first tree to grow after land was cleared or burned, and this regenerative quality made it sacred in both Germanic and Norse traditions. The use of its sap in healing reflected this belief, returning vitality to the sick and offering the promise of recovery after hardship. In the healer's practice, birch sap was a seasonal treasure, a clear, life-giving elixir that marked the changing of the year and the persistence of health in a cold and often merciless land in Viking herbal medicine. Juniper was revered for its powerful cleansing properties, both physical and spiritual. Growing abundantly in the rocky soils of Scandinavia, juniper bushes with their prickly needles and aromatic berries were among the most trusted tools in a healer's repertoire. Whether burned, boiled, or brewed, juniper was used to purify the body, the air, and even the spirit. Juniper berries were commonly used as a diuretic and a remedy for urinary tract infections. When consumed as a tea or decoction, they stimulate kidney function, helping the body to flush out excess water and harmful substances. This made them especially useful during illnesses that involved swelling, bloating, or lingering fevers. The berries also had mild antiseptic properties, allowing them to address infections from within, a crucial function in an age with no antibiotics for respiratory issues. Juniper smoke played a vital role. Healers would burn dried juniper branches and let the smoke fill a room or a tent, believing it could drive out disease. This wasn't just symbolic. The antimicrobial compounds in juniper smoke helped disinfect the air during outbreaks of sickness or after a death. Viking homes and ships might be cleansed in this way. The practice was both practical and spiritual, banishing what could be seen and what could not. In steam baths and sweat lodges, the tradition shared across many northern European cultures, juniper branches were sometimes laid on the hot stones or added to the water. As the vapor rose, it carried the sharp, invigorating scent of the plant, opening the lungs and inducing heavy sweating. This was thought to cleanse the body of toxins and the soul of imbalance. Reconnecting a person with the rhythms of nature and health, juniper also held ritual importance. Branches might be hung over doorways to ward off evil, or carried in small bundles by travelers for protection. Its strong, earthy fragrance symbolized resilience, and its presence in healing was a reminder that purification was as much about the unseen forces as it was about physical ailments. For Viking healers, juniper was not merely a remedy. It was a symbol of renewal and defense, a guardian plant that stood between the fragile human body and the chaotic forces of the world. Its sharp needles and potent berries helped them keep sickness at bay, one breath of smoke or sip of tea at a time. Among the many herbs known to Viking healers, Meadowsweet Filipendula ulmaria was particularly valued for its ability to ease pain and reduce inflammation, found in damp meadows and along riverbanks. This fragrant plant with creamy white flowers was a staple in early Germanic and Norse herbal medicine. Though they lacked modern terminology, Viking healers recognized that some plants had the power to cool fevers, relieve discomfort, and help the body recover more gently. Meadowsweet was often used to treat headaches, joint pain, and digestive problems. The flowers and leaves were dried and steeped into teas, which were given to patients suffering from fevers or general aches, common complaints in a harsh climate where physical labor and exposure were part of daily life. The herb's soothing effects made it an essential remedy during times of illness and recovery. Unbeknownst to the Vikings, Meadowsweet contains compounds similar to salicylic acid, the basis for modern aspirin. This natural pain-relieving ability explains why it was so effective and frequently used. Healers didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the results. Less fever, reduced swelling, and relief from discomfort. These benefits were especially important during the winter months when colds, joint pain, and respiratory infections were widespread for digestive issues. Meadowsweet was considered a gentle treatment for nausea, heartburn, and stomach cramps. Its calming properties helped settle the stomach. It was sometimes combined with other herbs like chamomile or mint, if available, to create a broader treatment. The plant's sweet scent also made it a comforting addition to healing rituals, which often blended the sensory with the medicinal. Meadowsweet's role wasn't limited to physical healing. Its delicate, almost ethereal presence tied it to the natural cycles of growth and decay, life and death. As with many Viking remedies, its use may have included symbolic gestures, such as laying its flowers near the ill, or including it in burial rites to ease the journey to the afterlife. Some sagas and later folk traditions refer to sweet-smelling herbs as gifts from the gods or spirits of the land. In a culture that respected strength but understood the necessity of healing, Metasweet was a quiet yet powerful ally. It helped warriors rest, allowed children to recover, and gave the elderly comfort in their final years for the healer. It was one of the gentlest and most reliable tools in their care. Mugwort Artemisia vulgaris held a special place in the Viking healer's practice, not only as a medicinal herb, but also as a spiritual tool. Known across northern Europe for its bitter aroma and silvery leaves, mugwort was considered one of the most sacred plants in Germanic tradition for Viking societies, where healing was never just physical. Mugwort served as a bridge between the body, the mind, and the unseen world. Medicinally, mugwort was used to treat a wide range of ailments. It helped with digestive problems, menstrual irregularities, and fatigue. The tea made from its leaves was used to ease stomach cramps, stimulate appetite, and support the liver. Viking women in particular relied on mugwort to regulate their cycles and aid with childbirth. In a world without midwives or formal obstetrics, the healer's knowledge of such herbs was vital for survival during pregnancy and delivery. Mugwort also had powerful nervine properties, meaning it calmed the nervous system. For warriors who experienced restlessness or nightmares, mugwort tea or smoke was thought to restore inner balance and protect the mind. Sleep, which was often disturbed after battle or illness, could be coaxed back by burning dried mugwort near the bedside or placing it under the pillow. This wasn't simply superstition. Many aromatic herbs do have mild sedative effects, but beyond its medicinal uses, mugwort was strongly linked to ritual and magic. Viking healers and wise women, often referred to as Valur or Seigener, used mugwort in ceremonies to invoke dreams, protection, or visions. It was sometimes burned during rites of cider, the Norse form of trance magic and prophecy. The rising smoke was believed to carry prayers to the gods or ward off harmful spirits. Healers might also use mugwort during solstice ceremonies, seasonal changes, or in times of emotional distress. A bundle of mugwort could be hung over the door for protection, carried in a pouch during travel, or placed on the body during healing rituals. Its bitter scent and strong energy made it a plant of thresholds used when the body or soul was in transition. To the Viking healer, mugwort was more than a plant. It was an ancient ally, one that stood at the intersection of medicine and magic, guiding the sick not only toward physical recovery, but toward spiritual realignment with the world and the gods. Among the most practical and powerful remedies in the Viking healer's collection was garlic Allium sativum. Though not native to Scandinavia, garlic had long been traded across Europe and may have reached the Viking world through early contact with the British Isles, Frankish territories, and eastern markets. Its strong scent and potent medicinal qualities made it an essential part of early Norse medicine, especially for infections, parasites, and protection against disease. Garlic's antibacterial and antifungal properties were well known, even if not scientifically understood. Viking healers used crushed garlic in poultices to clean wounds and prevent festering, particularly important for injuries sustained during battle or travel. When applied directly to cuts, garlic could kill harmful microbes and reduce inflammation. Though painful, this treatment was effective in preventing deeper infections in a time when even minor wounds could turn deadly. Internally, garlic was often eaten raw, pounded into pastes, or brewed into strong infusions. It was believed to strengthen the immune system, purify the blood, and warm the body during illness. In harsh northern winters, when colds, fevers, and coughs were widespread, garlic served as a valuable tonic. It was sometimes combined with honey, another antimicrobial agent, to make the strong flavor more palatable and to enhance its healing effect. Garlic was also used to treat parasites, especially intestinal worms, which were common due to poor sanitation and frequent contact with livestock. A mixture of garlic and vinegar was administered in small doses to purge the body. Its pungent nature made it a strong cleansing agent, and its association with vitality gave it symbolic weight in Norse healing traditions. Beyond the body, garlic was believed to repel evil spirits and malevolent forces. Healers or household members might hang braided garlic near doorways or in sleeping areas, not just to ward off disease, but to protect from unseen dangers, especially during times of illness, war, or childbirth. It served both as a physical remedy and a spiritual safeguard. For Viking warriors, garlic was not only a cure, but a form of daily defense. Before raids or journeys, Some are believed to have consumed it as part of preparation, viewing its strength and fire as a shield within the body. In this way, garlic stood as a symbol of endurance, fighting infection, energizing the weak, and anchoring the body in a dangerous, ever-changing world. In the Viking Age, the stinging nettle Urtica dioica was more than a nuisance. It was a plant of power. Despite its painful sting, nettle was one of the most useful and respected herbs in Norse healing traditions. It grew abundantly in meadows, forest edges, and near settlements, making it easily accessible to healers and households alike. Its medicinal benefits were numerous, and its resilience in harsh conditions mirrored the strength and endurance the Vikings valued. Nettle was used primarily to treat conditions related to blood and vitality. Viking healers prepared nettle teas or broths to combat fatigue, iron deficiency, and overall weakness, rich in iron. Calcium and vitamin C. Nettle acted as a natural tonic, especially important during long winters when fresh food was scarce and illness spread easily. Warriors recovering from battle or children recovering from fever were often given nettle to rebuild strength. The leaves were dried or cooked to reduce their sting and then brewed into infusions. These drinks were believed to purify the blood, promote circulation, and encourage the body to rid itself of harmful substances. Nettle also had a mild diuretic effect, making it useful for treating fluid retention and joint pain, common issues among laborers and older community members. In external treatments, nettle was sometimes used in surprising ways. The practice of urtication, striking sore limbs with fresh nettle stalks, was used to stimulate circulation and relieve arthritis or muscle stiffness. Though painful, it was believed to bring warmth and life back to cold or stiff areas of the body. This method, though unusual by modern standards, was rooted in generations of observation and belief in the plant's invigorating properties. Nettle also served practical roles beyond medicine. Its fibers were used to make rope, fishing nets, and even cloth, especially during times when flax or wool was scarce. This dual utility, nourishing the body and supporting daily life, made nettle a deeply integrated part of Viking culture. Symbolically, nettle was a plant of resilience. It thrived in disturbed soil and returned year after year, no matter how often it was cut back. In Norse society, where survival required both strength and adaptation, nettle embodied those values. For the healer, it was a reminder that even the most painful plants could bring healing, and that power often came from what first seemed harmful. Viking herbal medicine was never written down in formal text during the age itself. Instead, it lived in the spoken word, in chants passed from mother to daughter, in gestures shared among wise women, and in the quiet work of healers who blended tradition, observation, and belief. These practices formed a body of knowledge deeply rooted in both the natural environment and Norse cosmology. To treat illness in the Viking world was not just to cure the body, but to restore balance to the person, the household, and the invisible threads connecting them to the gods. Healers in Viking society worked with what the land provided. They knew which herbs to gather in spring, which roots to dry in autumn, and how to preserve medicinal plants through the long winter months. Yarrow, angelica, birch, juniper, meadowsweet, mugwort, garlic, and nettle each had a specific role, but all were part of a larger system of understanding the body in harmony with nature. Treatments were physical, yes, but also symbolic. Illness might be seen as a disturbance in faith, a challenge from the gods, or an imbalance between the seen and unseen worlds. Women played a central role in maintaining and passing down this knowledge. In longhouses and farmsteads, female healers oversaw the care of families and communities. Some took on more specialized roles, like the Valur seers who blended healing with prophecy, often called upon during crises. Their work often included sacred herbs, spiritual rituals, and appeals to divine forces like Frigg, Air, or Freya. Healing was not just a duty, it was an act of connection between mortal life and the mythic world. With the spread of Christianity and the decline of Norse paganism, much of this oral tradition faded or was absorbed into new religious frameworks. Monasteries adopted and preserved some of the herbs and techniques, while others disappeared or became entangled in superstition and fear. But echoes of Viking herbal medicine can still be found today in Scandinavian folk healing, in modern herbalism, and in the renewed interest in ancestral plant knowledge. The The legacy of Viking healers lies not just in the herbs they used, but in the worldview they preserve that nature holds power, that healing is both physical and spiritual, and that wisdom often resides in the hands of those who listen to the land. Joan of Arc was born in the winter of 1412 in the rural village of Domremy, a quiet hamlet in northeastern France, nestled near the border of Burgundy. At the time, France was fractured by war and civil unrest. The 100 Years' War between England and France had already dragged on for decades, and northern France was caught in the crossfire. Joan was born into this turbulence, the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romay, devout peasants who raised their children in the Roman Catholic faith. Her family lived modestly. They owned a small patch of land, a few animals, and relied on farming to survive. Joan was not taught to read or write like most girls of her class, but she was known for her hard work and deep religious devotion from an early age. She spent much of her childhood helping around the house, tending sheep and attending church. Her world was humble and steeped in faith. The voices she would later claim to hear would come to someone who already spent hours in prayer and contemplation. Domremy itself was a contested area, though technically loyal to the French crown. It bordered Burgundian territory, a faction allied with the English. The threat of violence was constant. Raids by Anglo-Burgundian forces occasionally swept through the region, destroying crops and burning homes. Joan would have grown up with stories of heroism and defeat, of saints and warriors, of kings and traitors. Her early years were shaped by instability, fear, and a longing for peace, despite the fear that hung over France. Joan's childhood was not without community. She was well liked in the village and described by neighbors as kind, pious, and unusually serious for her age. She often prayed at a nearby chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, where she would later claim her divine mission began. These years laid the spiritual and emotional foundation for what would come. Her faith, her loyalty to the king, and her sense of purpose were not formed in the royal court, but in the fields and chapels of her village. From such humble origins, no one could have imagined that this peasant girl, illiterate, unknown, and barely a teenager, would one day stand before kings, lead armies, and challenge the might of empires. At the age of 13, Joan of Arc's life changed forever. She later testified that in the summer of 1425, while alone in her father's garden, she experienced a vision, accompanied by a voice that seemed to come from beyond this world. At first, she was afraid. The voice, surrounded by a dazzling light, was accompanied by the appearance of figures she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, three powerful saints in Catholic tradition. These visions would continue growing in intensity and clarity over time. The message was clear but extraordinary. She was chosen by God to help save France. More specifically, her divine mission was to drive the English out of French territory and to ensure the coronation of Charles the Dauphin as the rightful king of France. It was a staggering revelation for a young peasant girl with no military experience, no formal education, and no standing in society. Joan told no one at first. She kept the visions private, fearing disbelief or punishment, but the voices persisted, urging her to act. Over the next few years, she became increasingly convinced that her mission was real. She began to devote herself even more deeply to prayer, fasting, and religious discipline, believing that her purity and obedience were essential for fulfilling God's will. By 1428, the political and military situation in France had worsened. The English had captured much of northern France, and the city of Orleans, a key stronghold, was under siege. The Dauphin Charles remained uncrowned, his legitimacy in question. Joan, now 16, believed the time had come to act. She traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and requested an audience with a local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, claiming she had a message for the king. At first, Baudricourt and his men laughed her off. A teenage girl claiming divine guidance was hardly taken seriously, but Joan was persistent. She returned again and again, speaking with a conviction that unsettled some and impressed others. Eventually, after hearing reports of her reputation for piety and learning that she had predicted a military setback in Orleans before news had reached the town, Baudricourt relented. He agreed to send her dressed in men's clothing and under armed escort. To meet the Dauphin, Joan's journey from peasant child to military envoy had begun, led by visions, faith, and an unshakable sense of destiny. In early 1429, Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon, where Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, held his court. The journey had been long and dangerous. She traveled more than 300 miles through enemy territory, dressed as a man to avoid attention and assault. When she finally stood before the royal court, she was met with skepticism and curiosity. Charles, unsure of her motives and wary of trickery, decided to test her. To begin, he disguised himself in plain clothes and hid among his courtiers. Joan, having never seen him before, immediately picked him out and addressed him directly. Witnesses were astonished. She reportedly told him details that only he and his closest advisors would have known, possibly regarding a private prayer or secret doubt. For many in the court, it was the first sign that something beyond explanation was at work. Still, Charles was cautious. He ordered that Joan be examined by theologians and church officials in Poitiers. For several weeks, she was questioned about her visions, her morality, and her doctrine. She was a teenage girl being grilled by learned men, yet she answered with composure and confidence. Her virginity was tested. As it was believed her purity was essential for her divine mission, the examiners found nothing heretical in her claims and noted her remarkable character and intelligence. Despite her lack of formal education, the court's advisors concluded she could be sent to Orleans with the army. But first, Joan requested something symbolic, something that would signal her role not merely as a soldier, but as a divine emissary. She asked for a banner. The banner she received was white, embroidered with an image of Christ and the words Jesus Maria. It would become her most treasured possession, and she carried it into every battle, declaring that she preferred the banner to the sword. She was also fitted with a custom suit of white armor and given a sword, which she claimed to have been divinely led to discover behind the altar of a chapel in St. Catherine, Delaware, Furboy, with her armor, banner, and a company of soldiers. Joan prepared to march toward Orleans. She was just 17 years old, young, untrained, and utterly convinced that God had sent her to save France. Her arrival at the besieged city would mark the beginning of one of the most legendary military campaigns in European history. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orleans had been under siege by the English for several months. Its fall would have opened the way to the heart of France, and with it likely the collapse of French resistance. Morale was low, supplies were dwindling, and the Dauphin's cause teetered on the edge of defeat. Then Joan of Arc arrived. She entered the city on April 29th, met by cheering crowds who believed her to be a miracle sent by God. Clad in white armor and riding a white horse, she quickly became a symbol of hope and divine favor. Her presence reinvigorated the French troops and citizens alike. Though she had no formal military training, Joan spoke with boldness and authority, urging immediate action against the English fortifications. French commanders, initially hesitant to take orders from a teenage peasant girl, soon found themselves drawn to her conviction. Joan urged an aggressive strategy, claiming her voices had promised victory despite her youth. She rode into battle beside the soldiers, often placing herself in the most dangerous positions. Her courage on the field inspired others to fight with renewed determination. Over the course of a week, the French launched a series of offensives to break the siege. Joan wielded not just her sword, but her banner, rallying the troops with cries of faith and purpose. She was wounded during the assault on the fortress of Le Tourelle, shot in the shoulder by an arrow, refusing to retreat. She returned to the field after having the wound dressed, continuing to urge the men forward. On May 8th, the English finally lifted the siege and withdrew. It was a stunning victory, one that changed the momentum of the war. For the first time in years, the French had dealt a decisive blow to English forces. Joan's role was undeniable. Her leadership, her fearlessness, and her spiritual authority had turned the tide. The victory at Orleans was more than a military achievement. It was a turning point in the national consciousness of France. The peasant girl from Domremy had fulfilled the first part of her divine mission. Now she turned her focus toward her second goal, to see the Dauphin crowned as king at Rheims, the traditional site of French coronations. The road to legitimacy had begun. With the siege of Orleans lifted, Joan of Arc's mission shifted toward a far more symbolic objective: the coronation of Charles the Dauphin. In her visions, this was not merely a political event. It was a divine command. Charles needed to be crowned at Rheims, the traditional site where French kings were anointed with sacred oil. But Rheims was deep in territory, controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. To reach it, Joan and the French army would have to march through hostile lands. Despite the risks, Joan was adamant. Her belief that God had cleared the path gave her confidence, and her conviction began to influence even the cautious Charles. After several victories along the Loire Valley, including battles at Jargeau, Mont-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, momentum was on their side. The army gained strength as towns submitted and morale surged. By July 1429, Joan and the royal court set out on what would later be called the coronation journey along the way. Cities and castles opened their gates without resistance. Word of Joan's miraculous success had spread. Many believed that to resist her was to resist divine will. Her presence in the army, young, determined and riding under her white banner, created an aura of invincibility. On July 16th, the French forces reached Rheims. The city's leaders, after some hesitation, surrendered peacefully the next day. Inside the Cathedral of Rheims, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner high. For her, it was the fulfillment of the prophecy she had received from her voices. The coronation was a moment of triumph, both for the new king and for Joan. From an obscure village, she had risen to command armies and to place a crown on a monarch's head. The people saw her not just as a heroine, but as a chosen messenger of God. Her presence had transformed the war from a political struggle into a spiritual cause. But success brought tension. With Charles now crowned, some at court questioned Joan's continued influence. Politics returned to the forefront. Joan had completed the task she was called to, but she was not finished. Her next desire was to press forward, to reclaim Paris. Yet the support she once commanded so easily was beginning to waver. After the coronation at Rheims, Joan of Arc pushed for a bold new objective, the liberation of Paris, still under English and Burgundian control. For Joan, reclaiming the French capital was not just a political necessity. It was part of her divine mission to fully restore France to its rightful king. But not everyone shared her urgency. King Charles VII, newly crowned and politically cautious, hesitated. His advisors urged diplomacy, favoring a negotiated truce with the Burgundians. But Joan remained resolute. She believed that delay would only strengthen the enemy, and that God had already cleared the way for victory. Eventually, Charles agreed to an assault on Paris, though without full commitment. He provided limited troops and delayed the campaign, weakening the effort before it began. Joan arrived outside the city in early September 1429 and prepared for battle. Paris was well defended with strong walls and experienced English and Burgundian forces inside. On September 8th, she led an assault on the Porte Saint-Honoré, one of the city's main gates. As always, she carried her banner and fought at the front lines, encouraging the troops with prayers and determination. The fighting was fierce. The defenders poured down arrows and stones. Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, but refused to abandon the field. She continued to direct the battle from behind the lines, calling for another charge. But the attack stalled. With nightfall approaching and casualties rising, Charles's commanders ordered a retreat against Joan's protests. The failed attack on Paris marked a turning point. Joan's reputation remained intact among the common soldiers and citizens, but at court doubts began to grow. Her influence over royal policy started to wane. Charles, now king, no longer relied on her as he once did. Political interests, fear of provoking further conflict, and distrust of Joan's spiritual authority began to eclipse her earlier triumphs. Yet Joan was undeterred. She continued to lead minor campaigns in the following months, capturing towns like Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier and La Chorite, often financing the operations herself with donations from supporters. But the tide was shifting. Her vision of total victory clashed with the king's increasingly cautious stance. Despite her injuries, her dwindling support, and the growing political isolation, Joan remained convinced that her mission was not yet complete. She would not stop until France was free. But in the shadows, betrayal and danger were closing in. In the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc continued her campaign, though her position had grown increasingly precarious. Her successes on the battlefield had not translated into lasting political power. King Charles, now more focused on diplomacy than, were offered only lukewarm support. Joan, acting largely on her own initiative, turned her attention to the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. She arrived in May 1430, hoping to defend the city and rally the local population, but the odds were stacked against her. The Burgundians, allies of the English, were closing in with superior numbers on May 23rd. Joan led a small force in a sortie to challenge the besiegers and disrupt their lines. As the battle unfolded outside the city walls, French forces were pushed back. Joan remained behind to cover the retreat, determined to protect her soldiers. In the chaos, the city gates closed too soon. Joan and a few companions were trapped outside. Surrounded by Burgundian cavalry, she fought until she was pulled from her horse and taken captive. Her capture was a devastating blow, not only for Joan herself, but for the morale of the French people. The girl who had once lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned a king now found herself a prisoner. The Burgundians held Joan for months, treating her more as a political prize than a common captive. She was eventually sold to the English for a large sum, an act that confirmed her status as a threat to their cause. The English viewed her not only as a military adversary, but as a dangerous symbol of resistance and divine legitimacy. Throughout her captivity, Joan attempted to escape more than once. In one instance, she jumped from a high tower, injuring herself badly, but surviving. Even in chains, her will remained unbroken. She demanded to be treated as a noble prisoner of war, not as a criminal or heretic. But the English had other plans. They did not intend to hold her indefinitely. They meant to destroy her credibility, her image, and the power she had come to represent. Her trial was already being prepared. Joan's capture at Compiègne marked the beginning of her final, most harrowing chapter. She had risen from obscurity to the heights of power, only to be betrayed, abandoned, and delivered into the hands of her enemies. But her story was far from over. After months in Burgundian custody, Joan of Arc was transferred to English hands and brought to Rouen, the English administrative capital in occupied Normandy. There, beginning in January 1431, she faced a formal ecclesiastical trial, not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic, a designation that allowed her captors to strip her of honor and execute her under church law. The trial was orchestrated by the English, but carried out by a panel of pro-English French clergy, led by Bishop Pierre Cochon, a staunch opponent of Joan and loyal to the Burgundian cause. Its true goal was not justice, but the destruction of Joan's legacy. By branding her a heretic, the English sought to undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII, whose coronation she had enabled. Joan was held in a secular prison, guarded by male soldiers. A direct violation of church law, she was denied access to legal counsel, threatened with torture, and interrogated repeatedly, often for hours at a time without rest or support. Despite being a 19-year-old peasant girl, facing some of the most educated men in France, she defended herself with remarkable intelligence and composure. Over the course of several months, she was questioned about her visions, her clothing, her faith, and her role in the war. The judges focused especially on her claim to divine voices and her habit of wearing men's clothing, an act considered both heretical and unnatural by church standards. Despite their pressure, Joan remained firm in her testimony. She maintained that her voices came from God, that she had acted in obedience to divine command, and that she had always remained faithful to the church. At one point, when asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, she famously responded, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a powerful answer, neither arrogant nor self-condemning, and one that impressed even her inquisitors. But the outcome was never truly in question. Political necessity outweighed truth. Joan was eventually condemned for heresy, based largely on her refusal to renounce her visions and her insistence on wearing male attire, which she had resumed in prison for protection. Her sentence was death. The girl who had once lifted a nation would now be silenced, not by defeat in battle, but by a court of men determined to erase her from history, or so they thought. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace in Rouen, tied to a wooden stake and burned alive. She was just 19 years old. As the flames rose around her, she reportedly called out the name of Jesus repeatedly and asked for a cross to be held before her eyes. A soldier, moved by her courage, handed her a small wooden cross. Witnesses said she faced death with calm resolve. Her execution was meant to be final, a warning, a silencing of a dangerous symbol. But it had the opposite effect. Instead of being erased, Joan became a martyr. Even English and Burgundian observers were disturbed by the spectacle. Some wept. Others openly questioned whether the church had committed a grave injustice. One of the English clerics present was said to have exclaimed, "We are lost. We have burned St." Over the years that followed, Joan's image only grew stronger. Her unwavering faith, her courage in battle, and her dignified defense at trial became the foundation for a powerful legend in 1456, 25 years after her death. And following a formal investigation ordered by Pope Calixtus, the third Joan's trial was declared invalid. She was officially exonerated, her name cleared of heresy. In the centuries that followed, Joan of Arc became a unifying symbol for France. During times of national crisis, particularly during the French Wars of Religion and later during the Franco-Prussian War, her story was invoked as a beacon of courage, patriotism, and divine mission. Artists, writers, and historians immortalized her life. Her face appeared in stained glass, sculpture, and literature. She was celebrated as both a warrior and a mystic, a simple peasant and a national heroine. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the Catholic Church formally canonized Joan of Arc as St. The girl who had been condemned by church officials was now one of its most revered figures. Her feast day is celebrated on May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom. Today, Joan of Arc remains one of the most iconic figures in world history. Her life defied every expectation. Peasant, prophet, warrior, prisoner, St. Through faith and conviction, she altered the course of a kingdom. Through fire, she entered legend, and through memory, she lives on. The life of a medieval baker began in darkness. Long before roosters crowed or church bells tolled, bakers were already hard at work. Their day often started around midnight, when most of the town was fast asleep. The quiet streets were cold and still, but inside the bakehouse flames crackled, flour dust hung in the air, and the rhythm of kneading began. Medieval bread wasn't made on a whim. It required precise timing and a practiced hand. Bakers relied on sourdough starters, carefully nurtured fermenting dough that gave rise and flavor to the loaves. There were no commercial yeasts. Everything was done by feel, smell, and experience. The flour was often coarse, ground at a local mill, and carried its own unique character based on region, season, and grain quality. Some bakers even mixed in bran, barley, or beans to stretch their flour supplies. Water was drawn from wells or public fountains. Everything had to be measured and mixed by hand, often in the dim light of oil lamps or candles. The mixing trough was usually wooden, and the dough had to be kneaded until it reached the right texture, a task that required strength and repetition. In colder months, the dough had to be kept warm with clothes or near the hearth to properly raise the oven. Usually a large domed brick structure had to be heated long before baking. Bakers would burn bundles of wood inside until the walls radiated enough heat to bake several batches of bread. Ashes were raked out carefully, and the oven floor cleaned with a damp cloth or a wooden peel before the loaves were slid in. By the time the town stirred, merchants setting up stalls, church doors opening for morning mass, the baker's first loaves were already out of the oven. The smell of warm bread filled the air. It was the scent of sustenance, of daily survival. For many in the medieval world, bread was the cornerstone of every meal. But for the baker, it was just the beginning. Deliveries had to be made, customers served, and records kept. And once the ovens cooled and the counters cleared, there was little time to rest, because tomorrow's dough would need mixing before the moon set again in medieval towns. Bakers' work never truly ended. To master the daily grind of medieval baking, a baker needed more than just flour and fire. They relied on a trusted set of tools, each shaped by generations of craftsmanship. The bakehouse itself was often a simple stone or timber-framed structure, but inside it was a specialized world. Every item had a purpose, and efficiency could mean the difference between profit and punishment. The heart of any bakery was the oven. Typically made of clay or brick, these were dome-shaped and massive, designed to retain heat for hours. Heating the oven wasn't quick. Bundles of wood, often oak or beech, were burned inside until the walls radiated the ideal temperature. Then the ashes were raked out and the bread loaded using a peel, a long-handled wooden paddle that allowed bakers to slide loaves deep into the hot chamber without burning themselves. The kneading trough was another essential item, usually carved from a single block of wood or built from heavy planks. These troughs were wide and low, allowing bakers to lean into their work. The dough was mixed and worked by hand, and larger bakeries sometimes had several troughs going at once to keep up with demand. Measuring tools were primitive but vital. Most bakers used wooden scoops or hand-carved measures for flour and salt. Though consistency varied, scales were rare and accuracy was often enforced by local guilds or town officials. Cheating customers by underweighting loaves could lead to heavy fines or worse. Flour was stored in cloth sacks or wooden barrels, while water was hauled in buckets from wells or streams. Some bakeries also had sieves for removing husks or debris, especially in more prosperous towns where finer bread was expected by wealthier clients. Coarser flours, however, were common for the lower classes. Perhaps the most valuable tool was the baker's hands, calloused, experienced, and trained by years of repetition. They knew when dough was ready, when the oven was hot enough, and when a loaf was just beginning to sing its final crusty notes. Everything had to be cleaned and prepared before the next day. The tools, humble though they seemed, were part of a larger rhythm, a cycle of labor, skill, and heat that transformed raw grain into life-sustaining bread. In the hands of a medieval baker, each tool helped feed a town. In the medieval world, bread was more than food. It was the foundation of every meal and a marker of social class. Nearly everyone ate it daily, but not all bread was created equal. What you ate said a great deal about who you were. The wealthiest citizens, nobles, clergy, and prosperous merchants demanded the finest bread, known as manchet or white bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour. This bread was soft, pale, and expensive. Producing it required extra labor, grinding, sifting out bran, and using only the most refined parts of the grain. This labor-intensive process raised its cost, placing it far out of reach for commoners. For townsfolk and tradesmen, Revel or wheaten bread was the standard. Still made from wheat, it was less refined, slightly darker, and more nutritious. It struck a balance between cost and quality, and bakers sold it in greater quantities than manchet. In some towns, regulations dictated that this bread must be sold at a fixed weight and price, preventing bakers from exploiting the hungry. But for the poor, the laborers, peasants, and beggars, there was maslin, or black bread, often made from a mix of rye, barley, and oats, and whatever else was available. This bread was dense, coarse, and sometimes bitter. In hard times, bakers might even stretch it with beans, peas, or chestnut flour. It was filling, yes, but also a reminder of one's place in society. In monasteries, bread varied depending on the order. Some monks ate simple loaves in keeping with their vows of poverty, while wealthier institutions produced high-quality white bread for guests and ranking clergy. Bread was also used as a social tool. During feasts, wealthy lords would use trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, as plates. After the meal, these were either eaten by servants or given to the poor. Charity was often dispensed in the form of bread, handed out at monastery gates or from noble kitchens. A skilled baker had to understand these divisions. They didn't just bake one type of loaf. They produced multiple varieties daily to meet the needs of the entire town. Bread wasn't just nourishment. It was economy, hierarchy, and identity baked into every crust. In a world where most people lived on little, bread defined who had more and who survived on less. Being a baker in medieval Europe was not just a matter of skill, it was also a matter of law. Bread was considered so essential to life that its production was heavily regulated by local authorities and trade guilds. Failing to follow the rules didn't just mean bad business. It could mean public humiliation, loss of livelihood, or even imprisonment. In most towns and cities, guilds could control the profession. These were associations of craftsmen who regulated quality, training, pricing, and supply. Bakers' guilds established strict standards for the weight, size, and ingredients of bread. These standards weren't optional. They were enforced through regular inspections and harsh penalties. New bakers often had to apprentice for several years before they were allowed to operate their own ovens. Guild membership was both a privilege and a protection. It gave bakers the right to sell in the town market and guaranteed some degree of economic stability, but it also bound them to a system of accountability. If a baker was caught selling underweight loaves or substituting poor ingredients, guild officials could fine them, suspend them, or revoke their right to bake altogether. Beyond the guilds, municipal authorities also monitored bread quality in England. For instance, the assize of bread and ale. A law dating back to the 13th century dictated exactly how much bread a customer should receive for a set price, which adjusted with grain costs. Officials known as bread weighers or ale tasters conducted surprise inspections and reported violators. Punishment for breaking bread laws could be dramatic. Some bakers were pilloried, locked into public stocks where they were mocked or pelted with stale bread and rotten food. Others were forced to parade through town with substandard loaves strung around their necks. In extreme cases, a repeat offender could be banned from the trade or exiled from the town altogether. These rules weren't just about fairness, they were about survival. Bread riots were a real threat in times of famine or inflation. Town leaders knew that if people suspected they were being cheated out of their daily bread, unrest could follow for the medieval baker then. Precision wasn't just a point of pride, it was a legal obligation. Every loaf had to meet the mark, because in the eyes of both the guild and the town, baking was not just a trade, it was a public service. Running a medieval bakehouse wasn't just demanding, it was dangerous. Fire was both a necessity and a constant threat. Ovens had to reach incredibly high temperatures to bake dense loaves, and maintaining that heat meant burning large quantities of wood, often in enclosed spaces made of timber, thatch, or stone blackened by years of smoke. Most bakehouses were constructed with a large domed oven built from clay or brick, positioned against an outer wall to allow for airflow and loading. To heat it, bakers lit a roaring fire inside the oven itself. This wasn't a casual campfire. This was an intense blaze meant to superheat thick walls that could radiate warmth for hours. Once the fire had burned long enough, bakers would rake out the embers, clean the hearth with a damp rag or sand-soaked brush, and begin baking. But even a moment's carelessness could lead to catastrophe. Embers could escape, thatched roofs could ignite, and in densely packed towns and cities, a bakehouse fire could spread with terrifying speed. For this reason, many towns require that bakehouses be located on the outskirts or built with specific fire-resistant materials if the baker could afford them. Bakers also faced health risks. Prolonged exposure to heat and smoke took a toll on the lungs and skin. The heavy lifting of flour sacks and kneading of massive batches of dough wore down the body over time. Burns were common on arms, hands, and faces, earned while loading and unloading hot loaves with long wooden peels. Some cities had communal bakehouses, especially in poorer neighborhoods. Families would prepare dough at home and bring it to a central oven managed by a professional baker. While this system saved fuel and reduced fire hazards in private homes, it introduced its own risks. Loaves could be burned, stolen, or tampered with. Bakers were held responsible for the integrity of each household's bread, and any negligence could lead to formal complaints. Because bread was such a vital staple, a disrupted bakehouse, whether due to fire, illness, or accident, could ripple across the whole town. It wasn't just the baker who suffered. The entire community felt the loss. Despite these dangers, the bakehouse remained the beating heart of daily life. It was a place of labor heat, and a vital routine where risk and reward burned side by side with every glowing loaf. While the image of the medieval baker often centers on male guild members and apprentices, women played a critical, if often overlooked, role in the daily production of bread. In many towns and villages, especially outside major cities, women were the primary bakers for both family and community. Their presence in the bakehouse was essential to keeping the ovens hot and the population fed. In rural areas, household baking was typically done by women. They baked for their families using communal ovens or small hearths, and in times of surplus they might sell loaves at market or from their doorstep. For many women, this side trade in bread offered a rare source of independent income in cities too. Widows of bakers were often permitted to continue their husbands' businesses, sometimes becoming successful bakery owners in their own right. Guilds were usually male-dominated, but not entirely exclusive. In certain regions, especially in parts of Germany and France, female bakers were formally recognized. Women could inherit licenses, run bakeries, and train apprentices, including daughters or nieces. Some even petitioned for full guild rights and won them. Though this required navigating legal and social challenges, women in bakehouses performed the same grueling work as men, mixing dough in massive troughs, hauling water and flour, managing oven temperatures, and selling bread in markets. Many also worked as bread sellers, walking through the streets with baskets balanced on their heads or carts loaded with loaves. These women were often the face of the bakery, dealing directly with customers and managing daily sales. Despite their labor, women were often paid less and received less recognition than their male counterparts. They were more vulnerable to accusations of selling underweight bread or poor quality loaves, and faced harsh penalties for infractions. Still, their contribution was essential, especially during times of war or plague when men were absent and communities relied on women to sustain the food supply. Baking also intersected with motherhood and caretaking. A woman who could bake well was seen as capable and respectable, keeping her household fed, preserving traditions, and passing down knowledge. In many families, recipes and baking techniques were handed down from mother to daughter like heirlooms. In every corner of medieval society, from noble kitchens to village ovens, women shaped the world through bread. Though history often left them unnamed, their hands were among the first to touch the dough that would nourish entire towns. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was sacred. Few institutions influenced bread making more than the church, which not only consumed vast quantities of bread, but also shaped its symbolism, regulation, and distribution. In monasteries, cathedrals, and village chapels alike, bread was a symbol of life, sacrifice, and divine presence. At the heart of this connection was the Eucharist, the Christian rite, in which bread became the body of Christ. The preparation of this bread, often called the host, was subject to strict guidelines. Only the finest white wheat flour could be used, and it had to be unleavened. In monasteries, specific monks were assigned to this holy duty, baking in silence, often at night in special ovens. These wafers were stamped with sacred symbols and handled with extreme reverence, but the church's relationship with bread went far beyond ritual. Monasteries were among the largest landowners and food producers in medieval Europe. Many ran their own bakehouses, producing vast amounts of bread for the monks, their workers, and guests. The daily monastic diet typically included multiple servings of bread paired with cheese, ale, or pottage. For the poor, monasteries also served as lifelines, distributing alms bread to beggars and travelers who waited at the gates. Cathedrals and parish churches frequently received bread donations from local bakers and wealthy patrons. These offerings might be displayed on feast days, distributed to the needy, or used in ceremonial processions. Some towns even had special bread altars, where loaves were blessed and handed out in memory of the dead. The church also played a regulatory role. In some towns, ecclesiastical courts handled disputes between bakers and customers. Especially in areas where the local clergy governed commercial life, they helped enforce fair prices and weights, often motivated by the belief that cheating customers of bread was not just dishonest, but sinful. On religious feast days, special breads were baked, rich, spiced loaves shaped into crosses, doves, or other sacred forms. These celebratory breads marked the rhythm of the liturgical year. They were often shared in the community to strengthen bonds of faith and fellowship. In the medieval imagination, bread was not only sustenance, it was spiritual nourishment. For the baker, supplying bread to the church meant more than earning money. It meant participating in the sacred economy of life, where dough became divine and the oven echoed with ritual as much as routine. In the medieval world, bread was deeply entwined with power for rulers, mayors. Guild masters and kings controlling the price, supply, and quality of bread was as important as maintaining order, because bread was the staple food for most of the population, often making up 70% or more of a person's diet. Its availability was directly linked to political stability. The most visible way this played out was through price controls. Cities and kingdoms established official rates for bread through laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale in England. which tied the price of a loaf to the current cost of grain. If grain prices rose due to poor harvest, drought, or war, bakers were expected to adjust the size of their loaves, not the price. This meant that during times of scarcity, bakers had to produce smaller loaves for the same price, often cutting into their own profits. But if a baker was caught shortchanging customers or selling loaves below the legal weight, the punishment could be harsh. Authorities saw cheating as not just theft, but a betrayal of the public trust. In some towns, bakers were pilloried, forced to stand in public stocks while holding underweight loaves. Others were fined, shamed, or even banned from baking. Bakers were also required to keep detailed records of grain purchases, flour usage, and the number of loaves baked. Inspectors could show up unannounced to weigh loaves and examine ovens. In particularly tense times, such as during war or famine, bakers were sometimes placed under military guard to ensure fair distribution. Bread riots were among the most feared expressions of unrest. When bread became scarce or unaffordable, mobs could form quickly. In such cases, bakers might be accused of hoarding flour or favoring the wealthy. Entire shops could be looted and records destroyed to maintain peace. City officials would sometimes seize grain stocks or subsidize bread to prevent starvation and protest. Because of its centrality to life, bread became a tool of both charity and control. Rulers handed out bread during public celebrations or religious festivals to win favor with the people. In castles, lords ensured their retainers and servants had ample supplies, reinforcing loyalty. And in towns, the steady stream of affordable bread was seen as the mark of good governance. In medieval politics, bread wasn't just food, it was power, and the baker stood at the intersection of hunger and authority. Though rarely named in chronicles or praised in songs, the medieval baker left behind a legacy that shaped the very foundation of everyday life. In a world of castles and cathedrals, kings and knights, it was the humble baker who fed the people. And while their work was done in darkness, before the town ever woke, its impact touched every household. The baker's influence extended beyond the ovens and into the cultural fabric of medieval society. From birth to death, bread accompanied every stage of life. It was present at baptisms, shared during weddings, offered in mourning, and honored at church altars. Every loaf baked carried with it centuries of tradition, belief, and survival. The skills of the baker were passed down through generations, often within families or apprenticeships. Techniques were taught by hand and by repetition. How to feel when dough was ready, how to read the oven's heat without a thermometer, how to stretch flour in lean times without sacrificing quality. These traditions were deeply rooted in place and community. A baker in one region might favor rye and oats, while another relied on barley or imported wheat. Every town had its own flavor. Over time, as cities grew and trade expanded, the role of the baker evolved. By the late Middle Ages, commercial bakeries became more common, and baking began to shift from small household craft to full-fledged industry. Innovations like windmills and watermills improved flour production and better RD. Systems helped grain move from farms to markets more efficiently. Despite this progress, the essential rhythm of baking remained unchanged. Rise, knead, shape, fire, feed. It was a cycle as old as civilization, and the medieval baker stood as its quiet custodian. Even today, echoes of their work survive in languages around the world. The word for companion derives from Latin com panes with bread, a reminder that sharing bread meant sharing life. The guilds that once regulated bakers paved the way for modern food safety standards, and the communal ovens of medieval villages laid the foundation for today's neighborhood bakeries. In the end, the medieval baker's legacy is not just in the loaves they made, but in the sustained life of a community. Through flour, fire, and faith, they fed more than bodies. They nourished entire societies.